Chapter 17 of the Stretton Street Affair by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 17th. What the Professor Found. When I met my friend Hambledon in secret at 2 o'clock that day, under the trees at a spot in the Retiro, not far from the great Plaza de la Independencia, we sat down and I described to him my strange midnight adventure. He listened in amazement, which was increased when I told him how the police had recognized, in the inoffensive lawyer of Burgos, the notorious bandit Despujol, who was wanted not only by Scotland Yard, but by the police of Europe. "But those carpet pins are a curious feature of the affair, Hughie," he remarked. "Yes, the police seem to attach no importance to them, but I do." "So do I. The opinion of Professor Vega may throw some light upon the affair." "I shall call at the Princesa Hospital to morrow," I said, and then I inquired the latest information concerning De Gex and his French friend. There was little to report. De Gex had not been out of the hotel, though Suzor had gone to purchase some cigars at 11 o'clock that morning. While Suzor was absent, De Gex had, according to the friendly concierge, received a visitor, a middle-aged Spanish woman of the middle class. She had asked to see him, and, on her name being sent up, the Great One at once gave orders for her to be admitted. Again the floor waiter became inquisitive, and heard the financier speaking in English with his visitor. "Unfortunate, most unfortunate," he heard De Gex say. "I am very glad, however, that you have come to me so quickly." "You had a telegram from Siguenza, eh?" "I received it only a quarter of an hour ago, sir," the woman had replied in broken English. Then De Gex had apparently given her something for her services, and dismissed her. "A telegram from Siguenza!" I exclaimed, when my friend Harry had told me this. "Now Siguenza is on the direct line from here to the Pyrenees and the French frontier. That telegram may be from Despujol while in flight. If so, the police have set a trap for him at his journey's end, either at Jaca beneath Mont Perdu, or at Pamplona. I wonder if he'll be caught." "He might go on to Saragossa and then turn to Barcelona and Marseilles," Hambledon remarked. "All the frontiers are watched, so it seems almost impossible for him to escape. But," I added, "I wonder if this information conveyed by the Spanish woman really concerned the fugitive. I wonder. A man like De Gex, with so many financial irons in the fire, and with agents in every European capital, is bound to receive visitors from all sorts and conditions of people who bring him information for profit. When one deals in colossal sums as he does, one has to cultivate people of all classes," Hambledon said. "Personally, I don't think the woman's information had anything to do with your mysterious friend's hurried departure," he added. "I do. I'm highly suspicious. There was some motive that he did not attack me, as he could so easily have done, for he's a most desperate character, and has committed several murders when cornered. His explanation was really wonderful, and I admit that I was so completely deceived that I actually apologized to him. But," I went on, "we may perhaps know more when we learn the truth from Professor Vega." Hence, at noon next day, I called at the great hospital in the Calle Alberto Aguilera, and was ushered into the Professor's room. "Ah, my dear monsieur," he exclaimed in French, knowing that I spoke Spanish only with the greatest difficulty, "I am very glad you have called. Those brass-headed pins which upholsterers often use, and which you have submitted to me, are most interesting from a toxicological point of view." "What?" I gasped. "Were they poisoned?" "Undoubtedly," replied the grave-faced old expert, "and by somebody who is au courant with the very latest and undetectable poison. I searched for alkaloids and glucosids, and used Kippenberger's process, and then the tests of Marne, Meyer, Scheiblen and Dragendorff. Since you brought the 3 pins to me, I have been active all the time, for the problem much interests me. At last, though I did not think that the substance could contain so subtle, deadly and as yet unknown poison, I applied Sonnenscheim's reagent, phosphomolybdic acid, and then I obtained a result only an hour ago indeed." "And what was the result, Professor?" He looked me straight in the face and replied: "You have had a very narrow escape from death, monsieur, a very narrow one. Had you placed your foot upon one of those upturned points you would have fallen dead within 5 seconds. Why? because each of the points of these 3 pins, left there as though by accident by some upholsterer employed by the hotel, was impregnated by one of the most deadly of all newly discovered poisons. It is called by men of my profession orosin, after its discoverer, Orasi, and is certainly a most dangerous poison in the hands of anyone with criminal intent, because no post-mortem examination known to the medical profession to-day would be able to detect whether the victim had been murdered or died of natural causes." "It astounds me," I gasped. "No doubt. But to me, of course, it is a most interesting piece of research," and the Professor went on. "I have never met this substance before, though I had heard whispers of it. Professor Orosi, who lived in Cologne a few years ago and is now dead, produced this poison quite accidentally, and among his intimate friends disclosed its existence, though he had no idea how to test for it with certainty. For 5 years all toxicologists made constant tests, until apparently, quite by accident, Professor Sonnenschein of Hanover discovered the reagent which would reveal the actual glucosid and determine its identity. It gives a yellowish-white precipitate," he added, holding up for my inspection a small test tube containing a liquid of the colour he had indicated. "Marvellous!" I exclaimed. "I had no idea that medical science could carry inquiries so far. I know that in criminal cases in London our pathologists, with their mirror tests for arsenic, fix the guilt upon prisoners in a manner most amazing, but I have never heard of this secret and most subtle poison which was placed beside my bed, the intention being for me to tread upon the impregnated pin." "And if you had done so, you would have been taken with a sudden fatal seizure, the cause of which would never have been detected." "You mean I should have died of poison?" "You certainly would. No medical aid would have been of any avail, for orosin is the most deadly substance which has ever been discovered. It is indeed good for humanity that it is known to only a few toxicologists, but that in itself reveals the fact, monsieur, that an exceedingly clever and secret attack has been made upon your life. A single puncture of the skin with one or other of those pins which were placed so conveniently at your bedside when you sprang out to meet the intruder, and you would by this time have been buried as one whose death had been due to natural causes." I held my breath. This declaration by one of the greatest professors of toxicology in Europe staggered me. A dastardly attempt had been made upon me by one of the most notorious of modern criminals. Why, no attempt at assassination is made without some motive, and the game must ever be worth the candle. The whole of the dramatic incidents of the night flashed across my memory. How I had faced the fellow in my room, challenged him at the point of my pistol, and compelled him to give me meekly proofs of his respectability. Truly it was all humorous, but only from Despujol's point of view. I recollected those innocent-looking pins which apparently had been left so carelessly in my room. Each held for me a sudden and suspicious death. "The slightest puncture of the skin would inevitably prove fatal," the Professor continued. "Feeling yourself pricked you would naturally remove the pin, and very quickly afterwards death would supervene. So prior to it you yourself would no doubt have removed all trace of the crime." "It is as well that such poison is not generally known, or it would be used by many who wish to get rid of their friends," I remarked. The Professor laughed and agreed, saying: "There are several poisons of the same type which are known only to toxicologists, and we are very careful not to allow the public sufficient knowledge of them. I must confess that I never dreamed when I commenced my investigations that I was in the presence of orosin. There is sufficient in this little tube," and he held it to the light, "to kill 100 persons. It certainly is one of the most dangerous of known compounds." "So it is evident that the man Despujol entered my room and placed the pins there, intending that I should step upon one or the other of them," I gasped. "Without doubt. And it seems little short of a marvel that you escaped," said the Professor. "It certainly does," I remarked. "But I must tell the police of the fact you have established. The affair now assumes a new phase. The man was not in my room with the intention of robbery, but in order to encompass my death by secret means. If you had not so fortunately avoided treading upon the pins, you certainly would not be alive at the moment," remarked the Professor, again reflectively examining the yellow fluid in the tube. What motive could the man have had in gaining access to your room and placing the pins there? I suppose he did not risk putting them there before you went to bed, as you might have picked one up on your boot, and that would have drawn your attention to them. By placing them there after you were in bed, he hoped that, on getting out, your bare foot would come into contact with one of the impregnated points. It was certainly a most fiendish plot," I declared, "and I thank you, Professor, for taking all this trouble with your analysis and so establishing the truth. I will go to the police and inform them." "Yes, I wish you to do that, for the fellow is undoubtedly in possession of orosin and intends to use it. Perhaps he has already killed people by the same subtle and secret means." "He must be arrested at all costs," I said. "Already the police all over Spain are watching for him, and special surveillance is being kept along the railways and on the frontier. Any person with orosin in his possession should be detained and examined," the Professor declared. "I wonder where he obtained it." "Who knows?" I exclaimed, but I was reflecting whether, after all, my presence in Madrid was not known to De Gex. If so, was it possible that he had hired the notorious Despujol to attack me in secret? "Of course, we know that there is a secret traffic in poisons. Medico legists with the police have established that fact over and over again," said Professor Vega. "But the vendors are very difficult to trace. One was found only 6 months ago, a doctor living in a suburb of Copenhagen. But orosin is not known to a dozen people beyond those who study toxicology. Hence this man Despujol must have been supplied with it by someone who knew. The suspicion had arisen in my mind that De Gex and his agent Suzor knew that I was in Madrid for the purpose of watching them, and they had resorted to a very clever and secret means of getting rid of me once and for all. If the notorious criminal Despujol was in their pay, he would no doubt afterwards blackmail them, now that the desperate plot had failed. Again, could it be possible that Moroni had had any hand in supplying this most effective and dangerous of all secret poisons to the Spanish malefactor who snapped his defiant fingers under the very nose of the police? As I sat in that quiet room of the Professor's, a room that smelt strongly of chemicals, though it was filled mostly with books, I could not refrain from shuddering when I reflected upon the narrow escape I had had. Yet if De Gex resorted to such measures, he must certainly hold me in great fear. Besides, if my life was threatened, so also was that of my friend Harry Hambledon, who remained so vigilant in the serene belief that his presence was undetected. At that time I never dreamed that the great financier who controlled the destinies of certain European states never moved without a police official being in attendance, and that surveillance was kept upon him as though he were royalty travelling incognito. De Gex, it seemed, was ever afraid that one of his enemies, the hundreds whom he had ruined by dint of sharp practice, unscrupulous dealing, and flagrant bribery, might seek revenge. Hence, though neither Hambledon nor myself knew of it, both De Gex and his toady and agent, Gaston Suzor, were well aware of our presence, and moreover were kept posted concerning our movements from day to day. Though we were in ignorance of all this, yet the desperate nature of the plot against me caused me to wonder what exactly was the fear in which De Gex held me. Of course it concerned Gabrielle Tennison, but exactly how I failed to surmise. One thing was certain, that the mystery man of Europe intended to rid himself of me, and in this he was being aided by certain of his friends, chief among whom were Suzor and Moroni. That the assassin Despujol was only a paid servant was quite clear, but the pay must have been a very handsome sum to cause him to dare to come to Madrid so boldly and run the risk of arrest. I smiled at my own innocence when I remembered how completely he had imposed upon me by showing me his papers of identity and the photographs of his pretended family. Truly only a great criminal could have remained so imperturbed and polite to the man whom he intended should die. "This drug orosin is a very mysterious one, I suppose?" I remarked a few seconds later, as the Professor, who had offered me a cigar, was in the act of lighting up. "Yes, a very weak solution taken by mouth produces extraordinary effects upon the human brain. The latter almost instantly becomes unbalanced, and the victim lapses into an unconscious state for days, even for weeks," he said. "Very often the brain is quite normal, save that a complete loss of memory follows the return to consciousness. In other cases orosin has produced complete and hopeless dementia." "Always hopeless?" I asked eagerly, recollecting my own case and that of Gabrielle Tennison. "Not always hopeless. There have been cases that have been cured." "Do you know any personally?" I demanded breathlessly. "There are one or two, very few on record. Professor Gourbeil, the well known alienist of Lyons, has observed 2 patients who recovered, but the majority of cases where orosin has been administered were found incurable. The mind is blank, the memory completely destroyed, and the general health so undermined that only the strongest persons can withstand the strain." At once I described Gabrielle's symptoms and general attitude, whereupon the Professor said: "What you tell me are the exact symptoms exhibited by a person to whom a small dose of orosin has been administered. In most cases, however, such a state of mind develops into actual insanity with a homicidal tendency. Such a patient should be very carefully watched, for in 90% the chance of a cure is, alas, beyond expectation." Chapter 17. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 18 of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 18th. More about the Mystery Man. One very important fact I had established. Orosin was the obscure and little known drug that had been administered to Gabrielle Tennison, as well as to myself, by the mystery man of Europe at his palatial house in Stretton Street. Gabrielle, being the weaker, was still suffering from its paralyzing effects, while I, the stronger, had practically recovered. Yet it had been intended by the daring Despujol that a fatal accident should now befall me. And could anything be plainer than that the fellow for whom the police were searching so eagerly was a hireling of the man De Gex who went in fear of me? That most secret and most potent of all poisons might be known to Moroni. Indeed, it apparently was known to him, and the endeavour had been to introduce it into my system by means of an infected carpet pin. On leaving Professor Vega, I at once sent a note round to Hambledon and awaited his arrival. When he came, I related all the Professor had told me. "Well, Hugh," he said, "we now know the truth, and it remains for us to combat the fiends. If you are marked down, no doubt I am also. So it behooves us both to be very wary." "Why can't we tell the police the whole circumstances?" I suggested. "My dear fellow, they wouldn't believe you, and they wouldn't arrest such a powerful man as Oswald De Gex," was his serious reply. "Money can buy immunity from arrest in every country in Europe, and especially De Gex's money, for it can be distributed in secret by his agents. No. If we are to be successful, we must lay our plans just as cleverly as he lays his. We must allow him to believe that we are entirely unsuspicious of his plotting. That is our only way." I realized that there was much truth in his argument. It remained with us to pretend ignorance. Therefore we resolved to still watch and wait. A few hours later I told Señor Andrade, the Chief of Police, of the Professor's discovery that the points of the pins had been infected with orosin, the newly discovered drug which in small doses produced loss of memory and insanity, and in larger doses sudden death. In reply he informed me that though every effort had been made to trace the elusive fugitive, all had been in vain, and that he was still at large. "But if he has this terrible drug in his possession, he is more than ever a danger to society," the Spanish official went on, speaking in French. "I thank you, monsieur, for all the information you have given me, and you may rely upon me to take every possible step towards securing his arrest. I was in telegraphic communication with the Paris Sûreté only this morning concerning him. I will wire them again. They have been stirred into activity by the message I sent them after your call to see me." I longed again to be frank with the affable Señor Andrade, yet I saw that if I were, I might negative all chance of solving the problem which concerned the health and life of the girl whom I had grown to love so fervently. Upon a sudden impulse I remarked with affected carelessness: "I hear that our English financier, Mr. De Gex, is at the Ritz." "Yes," he replied. He is here under an assumed name in connection with some big railway scheme in Estremadura, a line between Toledo and Merida. It is badly wanted, and has been talked of for years. There is a huge stretch of country south of Tagus, as far as Villanueva, without any railway communication. The king himself has been agitating for the development of that rich agricultural region for the last 10 years. And now it seems as though your great financier, Monsieur De Gex, is here to consult with the Ministry of Communications." "Yes," I said, realizing in what high esteem that mystery man of millions was held. "I do not think I would care to have such colossal wealth as his," remarked the Chief of Police. "As soon as he arrived from Paris, I had orders from the Ministry to place him under surveillance, because it seems he goes in fear of some personal attack upon him." "By whom?" I asked, instantly interested. "The information is vague," was the reply. Then, taking up a large yellow paper from his desk, he said, "It seems that he has applied to the Ministry for personal protection, and for a daily report of anyone who may be keeping observation upon him. There is a young Englishman living at the Palace Hotel who seems unduly interested in the gentleman's movements. We are watching him." I held my breath. This was an unexpected revelation. De Gex was in fear of us, and had resorted to that ruse in order to keep himself posted upon Hambledon's movements. Truly the situation was daily growing more complicated. Surely such a well-known man as Mr. De Gex, a man who was noted not only for his immense wealth, but for his generous contributions to charity, could not have enemies, I remarked. "Everyone has enemies, my dear monsieur," was the police official's suave reply. "Señor De Gex was here in Madrid a year ago, when he made a similar application to the Ministry for personal surveillance. He was here in connection with the foundation of the new Madrid and Southern Spain Banking Corporation, which is guaranteed by a group of French and Dutch financiers, of whom Señor De Gex is the head." He paused, and then continued. "He seems highly strung and nervous. All men who were in the public eye seem to be the same. Well-known foreigners visiting Madrid often apply for surveillance, yet there is certainly no need of it. And I confess to you that my staff is, after all, unduly worked." "I can imagine that," I said. "But is a strict watch kept upon Mr. De Gex?" "Yes, and upon his agent, Monsieur Suzor, also." "Has Monsieur Suzor been in Madrid before?" "He was here 2 years ago, when Señor De Gex had some big financial deal with Count Chamartin, who was head of the Miramar Shipping Company of Barcelona. They say he bought the whole fleet of steamers from Count Chamartin." "Was Count Chamartin wealthy?" "Yes, a millionaire without a doubt. But it is said that shortly before his death he quarrelled with his wife. Why, nobody knows. She lives at Segovia, and their house here in the capital has just been sold." "Was any attempt made upon Mr. De Gex?" I asked. "Well, a mysterious young Frenchman called one night at the Ritz, and demanded to see him. He was very excited, and when he was refused admission, he flourished a revolver. My agent on duty arrested the stranger, who was, after examination, deported. For that, Señor De Gex sent me a letter of thanks, and the scarf pin which you see I wear." The pin he indicated consisted of a single black pearl with the base surrounded by diamonds, an expensive piece of jewellery. That in itself was sufficient to show that Oswald De Gex was a past master in the art of bribery, and that he had established in the minds of the authorities of the Spanish capital that when he came there he came in the interest of the government, and hence he could do no wrong. Ah, how I longed to be able to tell my story to that charming official! But I saw that if I did so, he would not only disbelieve me, but put me down as an exaggerating fool. So I held my tongue. I further questioned him concerning De Gex and his friend Suzor. "Monsieur Suzor has been in Madrid before," he said. "He is agent of Señor De Gex. But how wealthy the latter must be! During the war he made a big loan to our government. The real extent of it is not known, but some say that he can pull the strings of the cabinet in any way he wishes, though the king disapproved of the whole transaction. At least that is the rumour. Yet, after all, Señor De Gex is a true friend of Spain, even though he, like all financiers, obtains huge percentages upon his loans." "True," I laughed. "Men of wealth are seldom philanthropists. One finds more true philanthropy among the poor, and in the artistic circles of Lower Bohemia, than in the circles of the ultra rich. Philanthropy is not written in the dictionary of the war rich, those blatant profiteers with their motors and their places in the country, who, having fattened upon the lives of the brave fellows who fought and died to save Europe from the unholy Hun, are now enjoying their lives, while the widows and orphans of heroes starve. "Ah, Monsieur Garfield, with that I entirely agree," sighed the astute man seated at his writing table with 3 telephones at his elbow. "In my official career as head of the police department of Madrid I have watched recent events, and I have seen how men who were little removed from the category of the worst criminals have suddenly jumped into wealth, with its consequent notoriety, and the power which is inseparable from the possessor of money." "The international financier, Oswald De Gex, is one of those," I said. "You cannot close your eyes to that fact." "You appear to entertain some antipathy towards him," he remarked, a little surprised, it seemed. "No, not at all," I assured him, smiling. "I only speak broadly. All these great financiers fatten upon the ruin of honest folk." "I hardly think that is such the case with Señor De Gex," he remarked. "But you are English, and you probably know more than myself concerning his career." "Nobody in England knows much about him," was my reply. "We only know that he is immensely wealthy, and that his riches are daily increased by the various ventures which he finances." "He is a great support to our Ministry of Finance," declared the Chief of Police. "It was Count Chamartin who first interested him in Spain, I believe. In any case, they combine to finance a number of industrial enterprises, including the great Guadajoz copper mine, which must in itself have brought them both a fortune." "You said that the Count is dead?" I remarked. "Yes, he died quite suddenly last year. He was one of the most popular men at court, and his tragic death caused a great sensation. He was taken ill in the Sud Express while travelling from Madrid to keep an appointment with Señor De Gex in Paris, and though he was taken from the train on its arrival at San Sebastian and conveyed to the hospital, he died a few moments after reaching there. He had a weak heart, and had consulted 2 doctors only a month previously. They had ordered him a complete rest and change, but, contrary to their advice, he continued attending to his affairs, with fatal result." "And the Countess?" "Ah, poor lady, she was beside herself with grief. She was his second wife. His first was the daughter of an Englishman who lived in Madrid. The present Countess is the daughter of the Marquis of Algeciras, and they were a most devoted pair. She now lives in Segovia in comparative seclusion. The Count's untimely end was a great loss to Spain." It was news to me that Oswald De Gex was in Madrid with his agent Suzor, in connection with the new railway scheme. Indeed, what I had just been told was all amazing, and showed De Gex to be a man of outstanding genius. The mystery man of Europe took good care to inform himself of any person who watched his movements or sought to inquire into his business. It certainly was a master stroke to pretend fear of assassination, and compel the police to act as his personal guard. By that means he had learnt that Hambledon and myself were in Madrid on purpose to discover what we could, hence he had hired the assassin Despujol to set that dastardly trap for me. Again it was upon the tip of my tongue to reveal the suspicions I had of the great financier, but I refrained, because I could see that my companion held De Gex in high esteem, as a friend and financial mainstay of his country. A few moments later I reverted to the possibility of the arrest of Despujol, for if arrested he might betray De Gex as the person who had paid him to place those infected pins in my room. In such case my story would be heard and investigated. But the Chief of Police shook his head dubiously. "I fear that he is again gone into safe hiding, up in the mountains somewhere, without a doubt," he replied. "It was an act of considerable daring to come boldly to Madrid and stay at your hotel, when he knows full well the hue and cry for him is raised everywhere, and that there is actually 10,000 pesetas offered as a reward for his capture." "Someone may betray him," I suggested with a smile. "Yes, we hope so. One of his friends, male or female, will no doubt do so, and come one day to us for the reward. Not till then shall we know the truth of that strange attempt upon your life. The motive could not have been robbery, as you had nothing worth taking save your watch. If he had been found in De Gex's room at the Ritz, one could have understood it." I smiled. The Chief of Police never suspected the true facts of the case, facts within my own knowledge which were of such an amazing and startling character that I hesitated to relate them. When I left my friend I again sought Hambledon and told him all I had learnt. He grunted. Very wily of De Gex to get the police to keep an eye upon me. If I'm not careful, I shall suddenly find myself under arrest as a suspicious person who is in the habit of loitering in the vicinity of the great financier. Yes, I agreed. This does seem to put an end to our present activity, does it not? Well, he apparently knows that we are watching, Hambledon said. What a pity we cannot tell the police all we know. If we did so, we should not be believed, and moreover, they wouldn't hear a word against the great man who is such a friend to Spain. Money buys reputation, remember. Nobody knows that better than De Gex. Hambledon was standing at my bedroom window looking thoughtfully down upon the Puerta del Sol with its crowd of hurrying foot passengers. "It seems a miserable ending to all our careful surveillance upon Suzor, doesn't it?" he grumbled. "True, it does. But now that the pair are on the alert, I cannot see that anything can be gained by remaining in Madrid longer," I pointed out. "Then you intend to give up on the quest for the truth?" "Not by any means," I replied quickly. "I intend at all hazards, and at all costs, to still fathom the mystery. What we have learned since we came to Spain puts quite a different complexion upon matters. We are now in possession of certain facts concerning De Gex, facts of which we had no suspicion. We had never dreamed that to further his ends he did not hesitate to employ a notorious criminal to commit murder with malice aforethought. Neither did we know anything of his financial dealings with the Spanish Ministry of Finance, or his partnership with the Conde de Chamartin, or that the drug he used upon poor Gabrielle and myself was the obscure but most deadly and dangerous orosin. All these are points which may in the near future be of greatest advantage to us. Therefore we must not despair. Let us take courage and continue to probe the mystery for the sake of poor Gabrielle Tennison," I urged. "Let us act as quietly and discreetly as our enemy is acting, and we may yet attain success." Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter the 19th. The Track of Despujol. Having decided to still remain in Madrid, I deemed it advisable to engage the services of a private inquiry agent to watch the movements of De Gex and Suzor, who still remained at the Ritz. The mystery man, living under an assumed name, never went out in the daytime, though Suzor often went forth, paying visits to certain banks and commercial offices in connection with the proposed new railway. The man we engaged was an elderly ex-detective of the Seville police, named Pardoe, who very soon discovered the identity of the secret agent employed to keep surveillance upon De Gex on behalf of the police, so that no harm should befall him. In consequence, I took Pardoe into my confidence, and calling him to my hotel, explained that I desired to keep secret watch upon the Frenchman Suzor, without the knowledge of the detective watching De Gex. I particularly desired to know the addresses of any telegram which Suzor may send. Probably he may send some message to Italy. If so, please discover the address and the text of the message. I believed that De Gex might communicate with Moroni, now that the plot of Despujol had failed. "I will watch, Señor," was the grey-haired Spaniard's reply. "If Señor Suzor sends any telegram, I shall probably obtain a copy of it. They know me well at the chief telegraph office. Señor Suzor appears to be transacting a considerable amount of business in Madrid. A scheme for a new railway, I understand." "Yes, I know. All I want you to do is to find out who visits Mr. De Gex, and whether any telegrams are sent by either him or Mr. Suzor." "I quite understand, Señor," was the detective's reply as he rose, and a few minutes later withdrew. Late in the evening, 2 days afterwards, I returned to the hotel to find the man Pardoe awaiting me. After I had taken him up to my room and closed the door, He drew a piece of paper from his pocket, saying in French, "Senor Suzor sent a telegram at 8:30 this evening, of which this is a copy." The message he handed me was in a pencil scribble, and was in English as follows: Charles Rabel, Rue de la Lande, 163, Montauban. Important that I should see you. Meet me at the Hotel Luxembourg, Nîmes, without fail, next Monday at noon. O. The initial O stood for Oswald de Gex. So the mystery men of Europe contemplated leaving Madrid. I thanked the man Pardoe, who said, "Senor Suzor did not dispatch the telegram from the chief office in the Calle de Correo, but from the branch office in the Plaza del Progreso. He apparently wished to send it in secret." "I wonder why?" I asked. The Spaniard raised his shoulders. The address conveyed nothing to me, but the message was proof that De Gex intended to leave Spain, and further it was a source of satisfaction to know his destination in case he slipped away suddenly. After Pardoe had gone I sat and pondered. It struck me as very curious that Suzor should have gone to a distant telegraph office in order to send the message. It seemed that he feared to be recognized by the counter clerk at the chief telegraph office. For over an hour I smoked reflectively. I confess that a curious, ill-defined suspicion had arisen in my mind, a suspicion that became so strong that just about 11 o'clock I entered the Jefatura Superior de Policia in the Calle de la Princesa, and again inquired for Señor Andrade. Fortunately he had been detained in his office, and I was shown into his presence. He seemed surprised to see me, but at once he became interested when I said, "I have a distinct suspicion that I know the whereabouts of Despujol." "Have you?" he exclaimed quickly. "What causes you to suspect?" "A man whom I believe to be an acquaintance of his has to-day sent an urgent telegram to Charles Rabel, Rue de la Lande, 163 in Montauban, in France, making an appointment to meet him at the Hotel Luxembourg in Nîmes next Monday at noon." "Who is his friend?" he asked eagerly. "I regret, Señor Andrade, that I am not in a position to answer that question. The whole matter is only one of suspicion, very strong suspicion." The Chief of Police looked very straight at me. "Ah! Then you are in a position of certain secret knowledge concerning the man who made such a dastardly attempt upon your life," he remarked. "And you suspect this Charles Rabel at Montauban to be the fugitive, eh?" "Exactly," I replied. He asked me to repeat the address, which he scribbled down, and then looking up said, "Personally, Señor Garfield, I think your suspicions are unfounded. Despujol, if he is ever found, will be discovered in hiding somewhere in the mountains of the north." "But why not in Montauban?" I asked. "He is apparently a well-educated man, judging from his conversation with me. He speaks French well, and perhaps passes as a French subject." "He could pass for a Spaniard, an Italian, a Greek, or a Frenchman," Andrade remarked. "And as forged passports are so cheap nowadays, and almost impossible to detect, the means of escape of such a daring criminal are both numerous and easy. But," he added, "I am interested in this person whom you believe to be a friend of the fugitive. Cannot you tell me who he is?" I shook my head, and smiling replied, "I have only come here to tell you of a very distinct suspicion I entertain, that Despujol is at Montauban." "Then his friend is your enemy, eh?" he suggested, his dark penetrating eyes fixed upon mine. "You know the motive of that trap which Despujol set for you, and yet you will not reveal it to me?" Again I shook my head and smiled. "It would make my task much easier," he remarked. "I am aware of that. But at present mine is only a suspicion. I have no actual knowledge that Charles Rabel is the man you are so desirous of arresting." "And you really refuse to tell me who sent this message?" he asked in a tone of disappointment. "It was sent in secret," I answered. "Indeed, it was that fact which caused me to suspect. You can, of course, obtain the original of the telegram by applying for it from the authorities. But it is only signed by an initial. How did you obtain knowledge of it?" "Again, I have no intention of disclosing the source of my information, Señor Andrade," I replied as politely as I could. "I am, as a matter of fact, here in Madrid attempting to solve a very remarkable mystery which occurred in London a few months ago." "This is most interesting. You never told me that before," he exclaimed. "I confess I wondered with what motive you and your friend, Señor Hambledon, living at separate hotels, had in remaining here. It was regarded as suspicious by the detective force that, being such intimate friends, you lived at separate hotels, and met in only secret. Reports have reached me of your movements, and of your meetings," he laughed. "More than once you have been regarded as suspected persons," he added. "Well, I hope you do not regard me as a suspected person any longer, Señor Andrade," I exclaimed with a smile. "No, no," he laughed. "But I confess you are something of a mystery. Why should the notorious Despujol dare to put his foot into Madrid and lay that deadly plot to kill you? You know the motive, and yet you will not disclose it to me." "Not at present," I said. "If it is found that Charles Rabel is really Despujol, then I will come forward and state all that I know." "You promise that?" "I do." "Very well. Then I will give orders to have your suspicions investigated," replied the patient, urbane official. "A detective shall leave by next train for Montauban with a request to the Prefect of Police of the Department of Tarragona for the arrest of the individual in question, if he should be identified." "Then I will accompany him," I said. "Excellent!" he exclaimed. "It will be well if Señor Rivero, the head of the detective department, whom you have met, went in person to France. I will ring him up at his house." He took the telephone, and a few minutes later spoke rapidly in Spanish to the chief detective of Spain. Presently, after a rapid conversation, he put down the receiver and said: "Señor Rivero will meet you at the Delicias station at 2 o'clock to-morrow morning. The express for Barcelona leaves at 2:15. From Barcelona you can get direct to Nimes and on to Montauban. And," he added, "I only hope you will be successful in arresting the notorious Despujol." I thanked him, and suggested that if we should be fortunate enough to identify him, we should watch for the keeping of the appointment at the Hotel Luxembourg at Nimes on the following Monday. "With whom is he keeping the appointment?" asked Señor Andrade. "That I will disclose later," was my reply. "I know that the appointment has been fixed, and if we watch we shall, I feel assured, gain some knowledge of considerable interest." "As you wish," replied the Chief of Police, who now seemed convinced by my manner that I was in possession of certain actual facts. "You will meet Señor Rivero, eh?" "Certainly," I said. "Then I wish the pair of you the good fortune of arresting the assassin Despujol," he said, as we shook hands and parted. I drove at once to Hambledon's hotel, where I found that he had just retired to bed. As he stood in his pyjamas, surprised at my unexpected visit at that hour, I told him what I had arranged. "Then I will remain here and watch De Gex's departure," he said. "Yes, but be very careful of yourself," I urged. "Keep your revolver handy, for you never know when an attack may be made upon you. These fellows, though great men in the eyes of the world, employ desperate characters to do their dirty work." "I'm quite alive to that fact, Hugh," replied my friend. "But we won't give up till we punish those responsible for poor Miss Tennison's state, will we?" "No, we won't," I declared determinedly. "Of course, we may be on a wrong scent, but something seems to tell me that we are pretty hot on the trail. The assassin Despujol would never have been employed by them if they did not hold us in dread." "Your journey to Montauban will prove whether you are right, Hugh," he said, and then, after arranging that he should follow Suzor should De Gex leave without him, and that he should at once wire me word to the Poste Restante in Nimes, I left, and, returning to the hotel, packed my suit case, and later met the bald-headed but famous detective. The latter proved to be an amusing companion, who, during the long night journey to the Mediterranean, recounted to me many of his interesting experiences. His French was better than his English, so we conversed in the former tongue. There was no sleeping carriage upon the train, therefore, after my companion had spoken to the conductor, we made ourselves as comfortable as we could in the first-class compartment which had been reserved for us. At 3:30 in the morning, with true Spanish forethought, he produced some sandwiches, fresh fruit, and a bottle of excellent wine, upon which we made a hearty meal, after which we dozed in our corners till dawn. Throughout the day my companion, who was quite as eager as myself to arrest the notorious Despujol, chatted in French as we went slowly down the fertile valley of the Ebro, and suddenly out to where on our right lay the broad blue sea. Not until late afternoon did we arrive at Barcelona, and having 2 hours to wait, we went along the Paseo de San Juan to the Francia station, and having deposited our bags there, strolled along to the Plaza Cataluna, where, at the gay Maison Dorée, we had coffee and cigarettes, while my companion read the Diario, and I watched the picturesque crowd about us. Rivero knew Barcelona well, so after we had finished our cigarettes, we took a taxi to the Central Police Office, where we had a chat with the chief of the detective department, a short, stout little man with a round, boyish face and a black moustache. After that we took another taxi along the toy fair in the Plaza de la Constitución, it being the feast of St. George, the patron saint of Catalonia, which accounted for the bustle and gaiety of the city. Then, after an interesting half-hour, we returned to the station and set out upon our slow 8-hour journey through the rich wine lands of Catalonia, with their quaint medieval villages and towns, with occasional glimpses of sapphire sea, and passing over many ravines and gullies, we at last, long after nightfall, entered a long tunnel at the end of which was the station of Corbeau, the French frontier. The usual prying douaniers were quickly at work, and after some coffee at the Restaurant Bocquet, which is so well known to travellers to southern Spain, we re-entered the train for Narbonne, where in the morning we changed and travelled to Montauban by way of Carcassonne and Toulouse. It was late in the afternoon when, on arrival at our destination, we took rooms at the Hôtel de Midi, on the opposite side of the Tarn to the prosperous, pleasant little French town, once a headquarter of the Inquisition, and even now containing in its museum the executioner's axe and many instruments of torture. After a wash and a meal, for we were both very hungry, we set out to find Monsieur Charles Rabel, whose address was Rue de l'André, number 163. We crossed the wonderful old brick bridge from Ville-Bourbon to the town, a bridge built in the 14th century, with an internal passage running beneath the roadway to the ancient château. Then, making our way past the old church of St. Jacques, with its fine Gothic octagonal tower, and passing through a number of streets, we found ourselves in the narrow old world Rue de la Lave. Just as we entered the street, which contained a number of small shops, I halted. "He must not see me," I exclaimed. "I quite agree," replied the Spanish detective. "There is a little café over there. Go in and wait for me. I will make some discreet inquiries concerning this Monsieur Rabel." Hence we parted, and while Señor Rivera sauntered along the street in search of the house in question, I went into the café and ordered a bock. Full of anxiety lest, after all, this man Rabel should be a respectable citizen, I waited. Time passed slowly. Half an hour went by. I ordered a mazagran and sat smoking, trying to suppress my eagerness. An hour elapsed. An hour and a half. 2 hours. I waited yet another half hour until the proprietor of the café began to look askance at me. Then I paid, and rising went out into the street. It was now dark. There was no sign of my friend, the Spanish police agent. He had disappeared. I stood upon the pavement full of anxiety and bewilderment. What could have happened to him? End of chapter 19. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 20 of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 20th. Mademoiselle Jacquelot. I returned to my rather barely furnished room at the Hôtel de Midi, which overlooked the place outside the station in the suburb across the river, and sank into a chair to reflect. The concierge, a lad who wore the concierge's hat, the concierge being off duty at his evening meal, informed me that my friend had not returned. He seemed an alert lad of that type so frequently seen in Continental hotels. Señor Rivero had disappeared. For an hour I waited, seated alone in my room reflecting deeply. My sole desire and fixed object was to solve the enigma of Gabrielle Tennyson's unfortunate mental state, and to bring to justice those unscrupulous blackguards responsible for it. As I sat there, her pale, beautiful face arose before me, the wonderful countenance of the girl who had, in such a strange and indescribable manner, taken possession of my soul. To analyze my feelings towards her was impossible. I put to myself the query why I loved her, but I was utterly unable to answer it. I loved her most passionately and devotedly. That was all. The tragedy of the situation was that I loved one who, alas, could not return my affection as a girl with her mental balance unaffected could do. Her poor unbalanced brain could never allow her to understand me or to return my love. I was tired after the long sleepless journey from Spain, and I suppose I must have dozed in my chair. I awoke suddenly, hearing a tap upon the door, and an elderly chambermaid entered with a telegram. I tore it open and found it had been dispatched from Castel Sarrazin, and was from Rivero, saying, "Absence unavoidable. Hope to be back by midnight." "Where is Castel Sarrazin?" I inquired of the woman. "It is about 16 kilometres from here, monsieur," replied the buxom woman in the strong accent of Toulouse. "It is on the road to Agen, and the railway junction for Beaumont de la Monge. Just a small town. They say that the name is a corruption of Castel sur Azin. At least, my mother used to tell me so." What, I wondered, had taken the head of the Madrid detective force out there? He must be following some fresh clue. So I went forth across the bridge to a big café opposite the theatre, and there idled till nearly midnight, when I returned eagerly to meet my friend. He entered my room just before 1 o'clock in the morning, tired and dusty, for he appeared to have walked a long distance. I had some cognac and a siphon of seltzer awaiting him, and sinking exhausted into a chair, he took a long and refreshing drink before he spoke. "Well," he said with a sigh, "you have been wondering why I disappeared so mysteriously, eh? The fact is, I was compelled. On making inquiry of a shoemaker who has a little shop near Charles Rabel's house, I learned that the man for whom we are searching lived in a flat on the first floor of the house kept by a widow named Killio. But he was frequently absent in England or in Italy. Only for short spells was he there, for he was a commercial traveller representing a Lyons firm of silk weavers." As we were speaking, the shoemaker pointed to a rather smart young woman who was at that moment leaving the house, and said, "Look, that is Mademoiselle Jacquelot, the fiancée of Monsieur Charles. She might tell you where he is. I do not think he is at home to-day. I saw him 4 days ago and spoke to him as he passed. But I believe he has left again." I thanked him, and at once followed Mademoiselle, hence I had no time to tell you, for I had no idea where she was going. I saw that by following Rabel's fiancée I might gain some useful knowledge. She walked to the station and took a ticket for Castel Sarrazin. I did the same. We had half an hour to wait, but I spent it patiently, and when we left I travelled alone with her in the same compartment. Soon I managed to get into conversation with her, whereupon I mentioned that I had a friend, Monsieur Charles Rabel, in Montauban, and that we had met in Paris. He had once shown me her photograph, and I believed I was not mistaken that she was Mademoiselle Jacquelot. At first she was surprised, but I told her a very plausible story, whereupon she explained that Charles had gone to Toulouse on business 3 days before, but that he was returning at noon to-morrow. She herself lived in Castel Sarrazin. "But do you anticipate that we shall discover in Charles Rabel the notorious Despujol?" I inquired eagerly. Rivero raised his shoulders and elevated his black eyebrows, saying, "From facts I gathered from Mademoiselle concerning him, I certainly think that we are really upon his track. It hardly seems possible, but we must remain in patience till to-morrow. Then, if we find our surmise correct, we must act with the greatest caution if we are to watch him to Nîmes, where he is to meet your mysterious friend, the man whose name you refuse to reveal. When they meet you will at once recognize him," I said. "I may be mistaken," I added, "but I do not anticipate that I am. If all goes well, then you will arrest the notorious Despujol." "I only wish that the fellow will fall into my hands," replied my companion. "If so, then revelations will be made that will startle Europe. "And incidentally gain you promotion in the service, eh?" I laughed. He nodded and admitted. "I hope so, Señor Garfield. I sincerely hope so," he replied, and we parted for the night. Next day I woke early and sought my friend. We idled about till nearly noon, when we went together to the railway station to watch the arrival of the train from Toulouse. A number of people were about, for the dusty lumbering express from Bordeaux to Marseilles had at that moment arrived, and considerable bustle ensued in consequence. While we stood watching the crowd, Señor Rivero suddenly touched my arm and whispered: "Look yonder, the girl in dark blue. That is Mademoiselle Jacquelot. She must not see me. I wonder why she is here, if not to warn him of the inquiries made concerning him by a stranger." I glanced in the direction he had indicated, and saw a tall, slim, rather good-looking girl sauntering idly in our direction. Her attention had, for the moment, been diverted by an advertisement upon the wall. "Quick!" cried my friend. "Let us slip back here." And next moment we had repassed the barrier, back into the booking office. "If she sees me her suspicions will be aroused, if they are not already aroused," said my companion. "The fact that she is here gives rise to the question whether she is really so innocent as she pretends. She may know of her lover's escapades, and suspects me of having followed her out to her home." "If she does suspect, then she is cleverer than you anticipated," I remarked. "Yes, but in any case we had better act independently. You return to the platform, for she has never seen you. You will remain well concealed and watch them meet, while I shall be at the exit to identify him if you find that you cannot get near enough of him without courting observation." As he spoke the bell was clanging, and there came the roar of the engine entering the big echoing station. I slipped back instantly upon the platform, and standing at a point against the corner of the book stand where I hoped to escape unobserved, I turned my head away as the train came along. Then, when it drew up, I held my breath anxiously as I turned around. The girl in navy blue was not far from me, searching along the train until, of a sudden, she espied a man in a dark overcoat and dark green velour hat, who had just alighted, carrying in his hand a small leather case. His countenance was ruddy, and he had a small black moustache. My heart fell. The man was a stranger to me. The countenance was not that of the man whom I had surprised in my bedroom at Madrid. He bent and greeted her affectionately, but next moment it was apparent that she was explaining something which caused his countenance to grow serious. He put one or two swift questions to her. Then, halting suddenly, he glanced at his watch. I strove to get sufficiently near to look well into his face, but I feared recognition. Would he pass out of the exit where the famous Spanish detective was awaiting him? Rivero knew Despujol by photographs, and indeed had been present when he had been convicted on the last occasion a few years before. Mademoiselle's friend hesitated for some moments, and then, accosting a porter, asked a question. The man pointed to a train on the opposite platform. Was it possible that what Mademoiselle had told him had scared him? It seemed so, for with a sudden resolve, instead of walking to the exit, he entered the booking office and bought another ticket. In an instant I dashed to the exit where the Spaniard was waiting, and in a few breathless words told him of the man's intention. To my amazement, Señor Rivero heard me unmoved. "I was awaiting you," he said. "The man you have been watching is not Despujol at all. Despujol, whom I recognized, passed out a few moments ago and took a cab to his house in the Rue de la Lampe." "Then you have seen him!" I gasped. "Yes, it is Rodriguez Despujol, without a doubt, Monsieur Garfield. You have not been mistaken, and we must certainly thank you for putting us upon the track of this dangerous assassin." "Then, after all, my surmise is correct, and he will go on Monday to meet his paymaster in Nîmes," I said. "The plot against me failed. Probably a second attempt is to be made." "We shall be careful not to be seen until he travels to Nîmes," laughed Rivero, well satisfied at the progress he had made. "But I wonder who is the red-faced man whom Mademoiselle has met," I remarked. "She has evidently warned him of some danger." "If that's so, we ought to see him," my friend exclaimed. "Let us go together on to the platform and watch. So long as Mademoiselle does not recognize me we are safe." With the reassuring knowledge that the man who was being sought for by the whole police of Europe had gone to his unsuspicious abode in the Rue de la Landais, we returned to the far platform, where a train stood waiting to leave. It was the Rapide for Paris by way of Bourges. The man was already in a third-class compartment, and as he stood with his head out of the window, Mademoiselle was chatting with him. Truly his stay in Montauban had not been long. The instant Rivero caught sight of the fellow's face, he exclaimed: "Holy Madonna! Why, it is the Mateo Sanz, the motor bandit! We have been searching everywhere for him. He shot and killed a carabineer near Malaga a month ago." Next second he had left me, and a few moments later hurried back. He had bought a ticket. "Sanz does not know me. As soon as we've left the station and are away from Mademoiselle, I shall be all right. Remain here. I will wire you, and in any case we shall be together in Nîmes on Monday. But be careful not to be seen by Despujol. He is a wary bird, remember." Then, unseen by Mademoiselle, he entered a first-class compartment of the train, just as the signal was given to start. The train moved off and I was left alone. Surely much had happened in those few exciting moments. But why had Mademoiselle Jacquelot warned her friend the motor bandit? If she had warned him because of Romero's inquiries concerning Despujol, then she could also warn the latter. Again, it was curious that she met Sanz and did not meet Despujol. Further, it was a strange fact that the pair of Spanish criminals had not travelled together, unless there was some reason for it. Perhaps there was. I watched Mademoiselle as she passed out of the station to a little restaurant where she had a frugal meal. Then she returned and took a ticket back to her home in Castel Sarrazin. Rivero now had his hands full. Not only had he identified in the respectable commercial traveller Charles Rabel the notorious assassin Despujol, but he had also quite accidentally come across Sanz the motor bandit, who of late had terrorized the south of Spain, and whose daring depredations were upon everyone's lips. Mademoiselle seemed to be a friend of both men. I returned to my hotel close by, and ate my déjeuner alone. My position was a very unenviable one, for I feared to go over into the town lest I should come face to face with the man who had so cunningly made an attempt upon me as the hireling of Oswald De Gex. But my thoughts were ever of my beloved, the girl who was the victim of some foul plot into which I too had been drawn, a mystery which I was devoting my whole life to solve. At 5 o'clock that evening I received a telegram from Harry in Madrid, telling me that all was quiet, and our friend, meaning De Gex, never went out. To this I replied in a cryptic way that our suspicions had been verified, and that the person of whom we were in search of we had discovered. We were only now waiting for the appointment to be kept at the Hôtel de Luxembourg at Nîmes. Next day passed uneventfully. In order to kill time, I took train to the quaint little town of Mossad, an ancient little place on the Tarn about 25 kilometres distant, and there spent the hours wandering about the countryside which is so famed for its grapes in autumn. I did not return to Montauban till after 7, and while I sat at dinner the waiter handed me another telegram. It was from Rivero, and having been sent from Lyons, read: "All well. Just returning to Montauban." Later I busied myself with timetables, and found that he would be due to arrive about 6 o'clock on the following morning. Therefore I possessed myself in patience, and I was still in bed when in the morning he entered my room. "Well," he exclaimed in French as he sank wearily into a chair, "I've had a swift and weary journey. Sanz has been alarmed by the girl. Why, I cannot tell. Did she go to see Despujol?" "No," I replied. "She didn't see him, but went straight home." "You have not ventured near Despujol, I hope?" "No, I have hardly ventured into the town." "Good. Well, we shall make a double arrest," he went on. "When the train arrived at the junction at Bonne-le-Comte at midnight, Sanz, evidently fearing lest he was followed, slipped out of the train and into another on the opposite side of the platform. It is a favourite dodge of elusive persons of his type. So, unseen by him, I also joined the train, and we travelled across to Lyons. There he went to a house in the Rue Chevreuse, close to the river, and when I had him safely there I went to the Bureau of Police, and asked that observation should be kept upon him until such time that we in Spain should demand his arrest and extradition. The Lyons police know me very well, so 2 agents were at once detailed for that duty, and I immediately made my way back here. It seems that Sanz is also wanted in France for a motor car exploit outside Orleans. Therefore, our discovery is indeed a lucky one." "Will Sanz be arrested?" I asked. "Yes, I have already reported by telegram to Señor Andrade in Madrid. He will at once ask them in Paris to order the arrest." "And Despujol?" "We have now to await his journey to Nîmes to keep this mysterious appointment with your friend." "Not my friend," I remarked. "Rather with my bitterest enemy." Chapter 20. Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 21 of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 21st. At the Hotel Luxembourg. As a detective, Rivero was of outstanding shrewdness. He knew that more could be gained by patience than by sharp activity, hence he did not go near the Rue de Lalande. Indeed, on the Saturday night we both left Montauban together, and travelled by that slow cross-country route through the Aveyron, by way of Sévérac, down to the ancient city of Nîmes, that quaint, quiet old place which contains more monuments of antiquity than any other town in France. Early in the morning we alighted at the station, high upon a viaduct after a sleepless night, and drove to a small commercial hotel, the Cheval Blanc, in the Place des Arènes, nearly opposite the Luxembourg, where the mystery man of Europe had appointed to meet the infamous Despujol. When I inquired for a telegram, one was handed to me. It was from Hambledon, saying that De Gex had left for Nîmes and Suzor was returning to Paris, therefore he would follow the latter. Having installed ourselves in the hotel, Rivero went to the concierge, and taking him into his confidence over a 20-franc note, told him that he was very anxious to know whether a gentleman named Rabel had arrived at the Luxembourg. Would he ask the concierge there, privately, on the telephone? The man in uniform at once rang up the Luxembourg, and addressing the concierge as Dear Henri, made the inquiry. The reply was that Monsieur Rabel was expected at noon. "Ask if a gentleman is expected who is engaged a private sitting room?" Rivero asked. The reply came back that a gentleman, believed to be English, had arrived in the night, and now occupied the best suite. His name was Monsieur Johnson, of London. I then described De Gex to the concierge, who repeated the description to the other hotel. "Yes, monsieur," he said, turning again to me. "Henri believes it is the same gentleman whom you describe." "Who is he?" asked Rivero, much puzzled. "Wait and you will see," I replied, laughing, for we now seemed to be within an ace of success. Just before midday we watched the arrival of the train from Montauban, and from it there descended the man we expected, the notorious Despujol. Though his features were unmistakable, he was made up to look much older, his hair being made grey above the ears. At his side there walked a man whom I instantly recognized, and sight of him, I must confess, caused me to hold my breath. It was the sinister-faced Italian, Dr. Moroni. We drew back, and, hastening to a taxi, returned at once to our hotel, from the door of which we could see the entrance to the Luxembourg, where a few moments later we saw both the travellers enter. What further devil's work was now in progress? We watched the hotel in patience until, just before 3 o'clock, the trio came forth, laughing airily. "Why, look!" gasped Rivero. "Despujol is with your great English financier, Señor De Gex." I smiled triumphantly. "I told you that I had a surprise in store for you," I exclaimed. "But if Despujol is with him, it must be with some evil intent." "That is certain." "While Señor De Gex was in Madrid we had orders to afford him police protection," Rivero said. "Possibly he suspected that some attempt might be made upon him. Certainly he has no idea of that man's true identity." "Yes, he has, for he has come here specially to meet him in secret. But why that Italian should be here I can only surmise. He is a doctor from Florence, named Moroni, a man of very evil repute. "But why should Señor De Gex meet such people in secret?" asked Rivero, much astonished. "I suppose there is some strong motive why they should meet, the more so now that I have proved to you that the notorious Despujol is a hireling of this wealthy man De Gex." "A hireling!" he gasped. "What do you mean?" "I mean that De Gex hired Despujol to make that attempt upon my life, and I have a suspicion, one not yet entirely verified, that Moroni prepared that deadly orosin by the agency of which it was hoped that I should meet with my death." "Do you really suggest that De Gex, one of the best known and most philanthropic men in Europe, actually hired Despujol to go to your room that night?" my companion asked, his eyes following the trio as they walked together and chatted beneath the trees of the Avenue Feuchères. "I do. And further, De Gex has every motive in closing my lips." "Ah! Then you hold some secret of his, perhaps?" asked Rivero, a new interest being instantly aroused. "I do. One that I intend to expose when I obtain sufficient corroborative evidence," I answered with determination. "But is not the fact of the three men meeting here in secret under assumed names sufficient proof to you that some fresh plot is afoot?" "Certainly it is," Rivero agreed. "But I wish you would reveal to me the whole facts." "It is unnecessary," was my reply. "You are here only to deal with Despujol. I promised I would bring you to him, and I have done so. Instead of living in obscurity in a high up frontier village in the Pyrenees, as you in Madrid believed, I have shown you that he lives in Montauban, where he passes as an industrious commercial traveller. If you search that house in the Rue de Lalande, you may find a quantity of stolen property. As a matter of fact, it has already been searched by the police of Montauban at my request," he replied. "The raid was made last night after Charles Rabel had left. I received a telegram from the Commissary of Police only an hour ago to the effect that 6 heavy cases of travellers' samples had been opened, and in them was found a great quantity of stolen jewellery, negotiable securities, and other objects of value, including 2 valuable paintings which were missing from the Prado Museum 3 years ago." "Then my information has been of some little use to you, eh?" "Of enormous use, Señor Garfield. You will no doubt receive an official letter of thanks from the Ministry of the Interior," he replied. "But we must act very warily. Despujol will not risk remaining here for long. Besides, some friend may telegraph to him that the police have been to the Rue Lalande." Once more it was upon the tip of my tongue to explain the manner in which I had become implicated in the evil deeds of Oswald De Gex and his sycophants, when of a sudden he added: "You must really forgive me, Señor Garfield, but you are an entire mystery to me. You have never been frank with me, never once." "I have been as frank as I dared," I replied. "I tell you that I am here to watch and to strive to elucidate a great plot, one which concerns myself and the woman I love. We have both been victims of a vile and desperate conspiracy." "And whom do you suspect?" "Oswald De Gex." "With what motive?" he asked, for he held the enormously wealthy financial friend of Spain in awe and admiration. "That, alas! is an enigma to me. I only know that he has made an attempt upon my life, and that at least one woman has been sent to the grave by foul means." "Do you really infer that Señor De Gex is an assassin?" he asked incredulously. "I only tell you what I know, Señor Rivero," I replied quietly. "I said that I would lead you to the secret abode of Despujol, and I think I have now fulfilled my promise, and shown you that he is on friendly terms with the greatest financier, whom you in Spain all hold in such high esteem." "There is certainly no man more welcome in Madrid than Señor De Gex," replied the police official. "At the Ritz, whether in his own name or incognito, he constantly receives our greatest politicians and most prominent personages. Even the King has more than once commanded him to the palace in order to confer with him upon acute financial problems in the interests of our country. And yet you infer that Señor De Gex is an assassin!" "I not only infer it," I said, "but I openly allege it," I added hotly, as I thought of Gabrielle. Rivero, glancing at me, quickly raised his shoulders with a gesture of disbelief. "Very well," I said. "At least I have proved to you that he is a secret friend of the notorious Despujol. Why is he here in Nîmes to consult with De Gex and his friend the Italian Moroni, if not for purposes of evil?"
Despujol has made desperate war upon society, and it is De Gex who secretly finances him. Hence he is the servant of the man with money." The dark-faced Spaniard reflected. "Well," he exclaimed at last, "what you have revealed is certainly most interesting." "And if you wish to capture Despujol you must lose no time," I assured him. "Remember, he and his gang have agents everywhere with eyes and ears open. He will soon know of the raid upon his retreat in Montauban." "No doubt he will," agreed my companion. "They will return presently, and then we will arrest him. In the meantime I will call upon the Commissary of Police. Come with me." We at once took a cab to the Prefecture, where we were ushered into the presence of Monsieur Coulagne, a rather tall, grey-haired, elegant man, with the rosette of the Legion of Honour in his coat. When Rivero introduced himself, the Commissary bowed to us both and bade us be seated. In a few quick sentences the Spanish detective explained the object of his mission, and, producing his authority from the Spanish Ministry, requested the arrest of the infamous bandit Despujol. "But is Despujol actually in Nîmes?" cried the Commissary, astounded. "He certainly is. I identified him on his arrival here at midday. We have been searching for him for over 2 years. He is wanted, among other things, for the murder of Madame Lescaut, a wealthy widow of Aix-en-Provence." "Ah, then it is not a matter for extradition, eh?" remarked Rivero. "We want him for a dozen crimes of violence in Spain. He attempted the death of my English companion here, Monsieur Garfield, who will give evidence against him." The Commissary pressed an electric button, whereupon his secretary appeared. In a few rapid sentences the tall, elegant French official gave orders, and the secretary retired at once to execute them. "Despujol is a desperate character. He is always armed, and possesses abnormal strength. He could strangle his strongest opponent," Rivero remarked. "I have taken precautions," replied Monsieur Coulagne, smiling. "I have ordered 10 men in plain clothes to go at once unobtrusively to the Hôtel de Luxembourg and arrest him when he returns." "That will frighten De Gex and Moroni," I said quickly. "And if they are frightened they will escape." Rivero laughed. I knew that he entirely disbelieved my statement. In his eyes the wealthy friend of Spain could do no wrong. Did not his king invite him to conference, in ignorance, of course, of his true character? I was not surprised at Rivero's attitude, yet I had hoped that Despujol's arrest would be effected without the knowledge of De Gex and his sinister medical friend. I pointed this out, whereupon Rivero remarked with sarcasm: "If what you allege against Señor De Gex and his friend be true, they ought also to be arrested." "Yes, they ought, and they will be when I am able to bring forward sufficient evidence to convict them," I replied warmly. "Why, I ask you, should Oswald De Gex be in secret association with that dangerous bandit?" The Spaniard merely shrugged his shoulders, while at the Commissary's request a dossier was brought in, and then they both went through a long catalogue of crimes alleged to have been instigated or actually committed by the man whom I had found in my bedroom, and who had so cleverly deceived me. The list was a formidable one, and showed how elusive was the man whom the police of Europe had been hunting for so long. Among the big batch of papers was a report in English from the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard, stating that the individual in question had arrived in London on a certain date, and stayed with a respectable family at Ham, near Richmond, representing himself to be a lawyer from Barcelona. Thence he had gone to Glasgow, where he stayed at a certain hotel, and then moved to Oban. Afterwards he had come south again to Luton, in Bedfordshire, where all trace of him had been lost. "Well," laughed Rivero triumphantly, "we shall take good care not to lose him now." "No," said the Commissary of Police, "my men will be armed, and will take him, alive or dead." "And De Gex and Moroni will then instantly flee," I said, full of regret that I had taken that step which might so easily result in destroying all my chances of solving that puzzling enigma of Gabrielle Tennison. Nevertheless, it was a source of satisfaction that at last Despujol had, by my watchfulness, been run to earth. Suddenly the telephone at Monsieur Coulagne's elbow rang, and after listening he exclaimed: "The men are already posted round the hotel, so all we have to do is to await his return." Hence I went forth with Rivero and the Commissary. Led by the latter, we approached the Place de l'Esplanade through a labyrinth of narrow back streets, until, on gaining the hotel, we saw idling in the vicinity a number of men who were apparently quite disinterested. We entered the hotel boldly, and drawing back to the end of the lounge after a whispered word with the concierge, we waited. For a full hour we remained there in eager impatience, until suddenly a figure whom I recognized as Dr. Moroni showed in the doorway. He was alone. He ascended to his room, where he remained for about 10 minutes. Then descending, he went to the bureau and inquired for the bill of his friend and himself, announcing his intention of departing for Paris by the train which left in half an hour. Rivero, who had been standing near him unrecognized, crossed quickly to where the Commissary and I sat well back from observation, and gasped: "They've gone. He is also leaving. Evidently they suspected they were under observation." "Ah, Despujol is a very wary bird," replied Monsieur Coulaigny, rising and walking out into the Place, where he whispered some hurried words to a stout, well-dressed man who was sauntering by, and who was his chief inspector. In a few moments more than half the lurking police agents had disappeared to make inquiries at the railway station and in various quarters, and when he rejoined us, Moroni having returned upstairs, he said: "Despujol cannot yet have gone very far. I have given orders for all railway stations within 200 kilometres to be warned. Let us return to my bureau and await reports." "And what about Moroni?" I asked. "He will be followed. I have already seen to that," was the reply. Back at the Prefecture, Monsieur Coulaigny was soon speaking rapidly over the telephone. Then we waited for news of the fugitive. None came until about 2 hours afterwards the result of inquiries was told to us by an inspector. It seemed that on the previous day a large open car, driven by a chauffeur, put into Carlet's garage, a big establishment in the Boulevard des Arènes. The chauffeur asked for a receipt for the car, saying that he had to go by train to Marseilles, and that his master would probably call for the car on the following day and produce the receipt. He asked that it should be filled with petrol in readiness for his master. About 2 hours before the police made inquiry, 3 gentlemen entered the garage, the descriptions of whom tallied with those of De Gex, Despujol, and Moroni. De Gex produced the receipt for the car. He paid for the petrol, and he and Despujol drove away, bidding farewell to Moroni. Despujol drove the car. "Ah!" exclaimed Rivero. "Despujol would not risk the train. He always arranges a secret means of escape. In this case he prepared it on the day before. Without a doubt he knew that watch was being kept." "Or was it that De Gex knew that I was here?" I suggested. "Well, in any case," remarked the Commissary of Police, "the pair have got clear away, and though we will do our best, it will no doubt be extremely difficult to rediscover them. They will change the number plates on the car, and perhaps repaint it. Who knows? Despujol is one of the most desperate characters in all Europe." "And Oswald De Gex is equally dangerous," I declared, for I was still no nearer the truth. Chapter 21. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 22 of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 22nd. Gabrielle at home. I had been back in London a little over a week when I read in the paper one morning a paragraph which possessed for me a peculiar interest. It ran as follows: "The notorious Spanish bandit Rodriguez Despujol, who has for several years terrorized Murcia and Andalusia, and has committed several murders, is dead. The police have been searching for him everywhere, but so elusive was he that he always evaded them. The celebrated Spanish detective Señor Rivero learnt a short time ago that the wanted man had been seen at Nîmes, where he cleverly contrived to escape by car. Certain clues came into the hands of the police, and by these Señor Rivero was able to trace the fugitive to Denia, not far from Valencia. He was hiding in a small cottage in an orange grove just outside the town. The place was surrounded by police, but Despujol, discovering this, opened fire upon them from one of the windows, and also threw a hand grenade among them, with result that 2 carabineers were killed and 4 others injured, among the latter being Señor Rivero himself. A desperate fight ensued, but in the end the bandit received a bullet in the head which proved fatal. A large quantity of stolen property of all sorts has been discovered in rooms which the criminal occupied in Montauban, in France. Despujol's latest exploit was an attempt to administer in secret a very deadly poison to an Englishman who was visiting Madrid. It was that attempted crime which aroused Señor Rivero's activities, which have had the effect of ridding Spain of one of its most notorious assassins. I read the report twice. So the defiant Despujol was dead, and poor Rivero had sustained injuries. Nothing was said of the powerful financier's friendship with the bandit. When I showed it to Hambledon, he remarked, "At least you've been the means not only of putting an end to Despujol's ignoble career, but also of restoring a quantity of very valuable property to its owners." "True, but it brings us no nearer a solution of the affair at Stretton Street," was my reply. Gabrielle's mother had returned to London, and that evening I called upon her by appointment. I found her a grey-haired, refined woman with a pale, anxious face and deep-set eyes. When I mentioned Gabrielle, who was in the adjoining room, she sighed and exclaimed: "Ah, Mr. Garfield, it is a great trial to me. Poor child! I cannot think what happened to her. Nobody can tell, she least of all. Dr. Moroni has been very good, for he is greatly interested in her case. They have told me that you called some time ago and evinced an interest in her." "Yes, Mrs. Tennison," I said. "I feel a very deep interest in your daughter because well, to tell you the truth, I too, after a strange adventure here in London one night, completely lost my sense of identity, and when I came to a knowledge of things about me, I was in a hospital in France, having been found unconscious at the roadside many days after my adventure in London." "How very curious!" Mrs. Tennison remarked, instantly interested. "Gabrielle was found at the roadside. Do you think, then, that there is any connection between your case and hers?" "Yes, Mrs. Tennison," I replied promptly. "It is for that reason that I am in active search of the truth, in the interests of your daughter as well as those of my own." "What do you suspect, Mr. Garfield?" asked Gabrielle's mother, as we sat in that cosily furnished little room, where on the table in the centre stood an old punch bowl filled with sweet-smelling La France roses. "I suspect many things. In some my suspicions have proved correct. In others I am still entirely in the dark. One important point, however, I have established, namely, the means by which this curious mysterious effect has been produced upon the minds of both your daughter and myself. When one knows the disease, then it is not difficult to search for the cure. I know how the effect was produced, and further, I know the name of the medical man who has effected cures in similar cases." "You do?" she exclaimed eagerly. "Well, Gabrielle has seen a dozen specialists, all of whom have been puzzled. Professor Gourbeil of Lyons has been able to gain complete cures in 2 cases. Orosin, a newly discovered poison, is the drug that was used, and the Professor has a wider knowledge of the effect of that highly dangerous substance than any person living. You should arrange to take your daughter to him." The pale-faced widow shook her head, and in a mournful tone replied: "Ah, I am afraid it would be useless. Dr. Moroni took her to several specialists, but they all failed to restore her brain to its normal activity. Professor Gourbeil is the only man who has ever been able to completely cure a person to whom orosin has been administered, and that has been in 2 cases only." "So the chance is very remote, even if she saw him!" exclaimed the widow despairingly. "I think, Mrs. Tennison, that Gabrielle should see him in any case," I said. "I agree. The poor girl's condition is most pitiable. At times she seems absolutely normal, and talks of things about her in quite a reasonable manner, but she never seems able to concentrate her thoughts. They always wander swiftly from one subject to another. I have noticed, too, that her vision is affected. Sometimes she will declare that a vivid red is blue. When we look into shop windows together, she will refer to a yellow dress as mauve, a pink as white. At times she cannot distinguish colours. Yet now and then her vision becomes quite normal." "I have had some difficulty, Mrs. Tennison, in that way myself," I said. "When I first left St. Malo after recovering consciousness of the present, I one day saw a grass field, and it appeared to be a bright blue. Again, an omnibus in London which I knew to be blue was a peculiar dull red. So my symptoms were the same as your daughter's. "It seems proved that both of you are fellow victims of some desperate plot, Mr. Garfield," said the widow. "But what could have been its motive?" "That I am striving with all my might to establish," I answered. "If I can only obtain from your daughter the true facts concerning her adventures on that fatal night last November, then it will materially assist me towards fixing the guilt upon the person I suspect. In this I beg your aid, Mrs. Tennison," I said. "I have only just returned from several weeks abroad, during which I have gained considerable knowledge which in the end will, I hope, lead me to the solution of the problem." I then told her of my journey to Spain and afterwards to Nîmes, but I mentioned nothing concerning either Oswald De Gex or Despujol. At that moment Gabrielle, unaware of my presence, entered. She was dressed in a simple grey frock with short sleeves and cut discreetly low, and looked very sweet. On seeing me she drew back, but next second she put out her slim white hand in greeting, and with a delightful smile exclaimed: "Why, Mr. Garfield! I remember you. You called upon me some weeks ago, did you not?" "Yes, Miss Tennison, I did," I replied as I sprang from my chair and bent over her hand. "So you recollect me, eh?" "I do. They said you would call upon me," she replied, her beautiful face suddenly clouding. "Who told you that?" I asked. "Doctor Moroni. He warned me that you were my enemy." I drew a long breath, for I discerned the depth of the plot. "Not your enemy, Miss Tennison," I assured her, "but your friend who is trying his best to solve the problem of your illness." "Yes, Gabrielle dear, Mr. Garfield is certainly your friend. I know that," declared her mother kindly. "Doctor Moroni must have been mistaken. Why should he have warned you against meeting Mr. Garfield?" I was silent for a moment. Then I said: "Of course, Mrs. Tennison, you have no previous knowledge of me. You are taking me entirely at my own estimation." "When I meet a young man who is open and frank as you are, I trust him," she said quietly. "You know that woman's intuition seldom errs." I laughed. "Well," I answered, "I am striving to solve the mystery of what occurred on the night of November the 7th, of what occurred to your daughter, as well as to myself." Mrs. Tennison endeavoured to obtain from me a description of my adventure, but I managed to evade her questions. "I wonder why Doctor Moroni warned Gabrielle against you," she remarked presently. "It is a mystery." "Yes, Mrs. Tennison, it is all a mystery, a complete mystery to me why Doctor Moroni, of all men, should take an interest in your daughter. He is certainly not a man to be trusted, and I, in turn, warn you against him." "Why, he has been so good to Gabrielle." "The reason of my warning is that he is her enemy as well as mine," I said, glancing at the beautiful girl, whose countenance had, alas, now grown inanimate again. "But I do not understand," Mrs. Tennison exclaimed. "Why should the doctor be Gabrielle's enemy?" "Ah, that I cannot tell, except that he fears lest she should recover and reveal the truth, a serious truth which would implicate him." "Do you think he had any hand in the mysterious affair?" "I certainly do," was my reply, and then I told her of my journey to Italy, and of my discovery of her daughter with Moroni in Florence. "But how did you know my daughter?" she asked. "Because on that fatal night I saw her in a house in London." "You saw her? Where?" "In the house of a mutual enemy." "Who?" "Mrs. Tennison," I exclaimed quietly, "at present I cannot reveal to you more than I have done. Please excuse me. When I have fully verified my suspicions, I will explain all that occurred to me, all that is within my knowledge. Until then, please remain in patience." "I never dreamed that Gabrielle had a single enemy in the world. I cannot understand it!" she exclaimed. "Neither can I, but the fact remains. The greatest care should be exercised regarding your daughter. Why did she meet that Frenchman in Kensington Gardens?" "I have only just heard about it," was her mother's reply. "It appears that Doctor Moroni introduced them. She had only seen him once before." Then, turning to the girl, her mother asked: "What did he say to you?" "He brought me an urgent and secret message from Doctor Moroni, telling me that there was a plot against my life. she replied in a slow, mechanical voice. "The doctor sent word to me that Mr. Garfield would probably call and endeavour to be friendly with me, but that he was my enemy and I should have no dealings with him." "Ah!" I exclaimed. "So that was the second warning given you, Miss Tennison. It is more than ever plain that they fear lest, by meeting, we shall discover the plot and its instigators. What else did he say?" "He told me that Doctor Moroni was still in Florence, but that he would be coming to London again very soon, and that he would call. He urged me at the same time to tell nobody that he had seen me or that he had warned me against you, not even my mother." "All that is in no way surprising," I remarked, "for I happen to know that Monsieur Suzor and the doctor are on terms of closest friendship a partnership for evil." "How?" "As I have already explained, Miss Tennison, I have not yet fully solved the enigma, though I have learned a number of facts which, though they increase the mystery, yet they give some clue to the solution of the enigma." "But their evil design?" asked her mother. "Their evil design is against us both, hence your daughter's interests have become my own," I replied. "My sole object is to bring to justice those who have, for their own ends, no doubt for financial gain, been guilty of the astounding plot against your daughter. You may believe Doctor Moroni and his friend Suzor as you will, Mrs. Tennison, but I shall not withdraw from my present attitude. That they fear me is conclusively proved." "I quite see your point," said the quiet voiced, refined lady. "Then I do urge you to have a care of Miss Gabrielle," I exclaimed. "If it is known, as it may be, that I have been here, an effort will surely be made to close the mouth of one or other of us. These men are desperate. I have already proved them so. Therefore we must take every precaution against surprise." "Why not go to the police?" suggested Mrs. Tennison. "Because the whole circumstances are so strange that, if I related them at Scotland Yard, I should not be believed," was my reply. "No, I, with my friend Mr. Hambledon, must carry on our inquiries alone. If we are sufficiently wary and active we may, I hope, gather sufficient evidence to elucidate the mystery of your daughter's present mental condition, and also the reason why a similar attempt was made upon myself." "Well, Mr. Garfield," exclaimed the charming elderly lady with a sigh, "I only hope you will be successful in your quest after the truth. This blow upon me is, I confess, a most terrible one. It is so distressing to see my poor child in such an uncertain state of mentality. Sometimes, as I have told you, she is quite normal, though she has no knowledge of what occurred to her, and at other times she is painfully vague and often erratic in her actions. She must consult Professor Gourbeil, the great alienist at Lyons. He has a wide knowledge of the symptoms and effects of orosin." The poor lady sighed, and with tired, sad eyes looked upon her daughter, who had sunk into a chair with her pointed chin resting upon her palms. "Unfortunately, Mr. Garfield, I am not rich," she said in a low, earnest tone. "I will give most willingly all I possess in order that my poor child be restored to her normal senses. But I have very little in these post-war days, when everything is so dear, and taxation strangles one, in face of what they told us during the war, that they were making England a place fit for heroes to live in. It seems to me they are now making it fit for Germans and aliens to live in." "My dear Mrs. Tennison, our discussion does not concern politics," I said, anxious for the future of the graceful girl whom I had grown to love so dearly, even though her brain was unbalanced. At first I regarded it as strange that, being fellow victims of Oswald De Gex and his desperate, unscrupulous accomplices, who included the assassin Despujol, I had been drawn towards her by some unknown and invisible attraction. But when I analysed my feelings and surveyed the situation calmly, I saw that it was not more extraordinary than in any other circumstances when a man, seeing a woman who fulfills all his high ideals, falls desperately in love with her, and worships at her shrine. Chapter 22. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 23 of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 23rd. The Death Drug. It was July. The London season, later in these modern days, was already on the wane. The Derby and Ascot had been won in glorious weather. There had been splendid cricket at Lord's, fine polo at Hurlingham, and Henley Week had just passed. London society was preparing for the country, the continental spas, and the sea, leaving the metropolis to the American cousins who were each week invading London's big hotels. I was back at Francis and Goldsmith's hard at work as I had been before my strange adventure, while Harry was busy at his legal work in the police courts. From our windows looking across the Thames between the trees on the towing path, we had a wide view of the river with the chimneys of the factories on the opposite bank. On the right was Putney, the starting place of the University boat race, and on the left the great reservoirs and the bend of the river behind which lay Mortlake, the finish of the boat race course. Each morning when I rose and dressed, I looked out upon the wide and somewhat uninteresting vista, racking my brains how to further proceed with my campaign against the great intriguer who could, by his immense wealth, juggle with dynasties. With Mrs. Tennison I had become on very friendly terms. Fearing to reveal myself as having taken that bundle of Bank of England notes as a bribe, I held back from her what had actually happened to me on that fateful night. But I had become a frequent guest at Longridge Road, and often spent many delightful hours with Gabrielle, who at times seemed quite in her normal senses. Yet at others she became vague and spoke in awed tones about what she had seen, all red, green, and gold. And often I sat at home smoking and wondering what she had seen that had so impressed her. Often, too, I discussed it with Mrs. Tennison and Harry Hambledon, but neither of us could suggest any solution of the mystery. Mrs. Tennison, on account of the slump in securities owing to the war, was, I knew, in rather straitened circumstances. When I again suggested a visit to the great specialist in Lyons, she shook her head, and told me frankly that she could not afford it. De Gex had, it seemed, sought his victims among those who had been ruined by the war. She had, however, told me that her brother, a shipping agent living in Liverpool, who was Gabrielle's godfather, was deeply interested in her. I suggested that she should write to him and urged that, as a last resort, Gabrielle should consult Professor Gourbeil. The latter had been successful in restoring to their normal mental condition patients who had been affected with orosin, that most dangerous and puzzling of the discoveries of modern toxicologists. Mrs. Tennison had acted upon my advice. Had I been in a financial position to pay Gabrielle's expenses to Lyons, I would have done so most willingly. But my journey to Spain had depleted my resources, and though I had those Bank of England notes still reposing in a drawer at home, I dared not change one of them lest by such action I should have accepted and profited upon the bribe which De Gex had so cleverly pressed upon me. In the first week of July Mrs. Tennison wrote to me, and that evening I went over to see her after leaving the office in Westminster. It was a hot, dry night when London lay beneath its haze of sun-reddened dust after a heat spell, parched and choked. Gabrielle was out at the house of one of her school friends, hence we sat alone together in the cool drawing-room, a room which was essentially that of a woman of taste and refinement. A few seconds after I entered, a tall, grey-haired man came in, whereupon Mrs. Tennison introduced him as her brother Charles from Liverpool. The man glanced at me sharply, and then, smiling pleasantly, took my hand. "I have come up to see my sister regarding poor Gabrielle," he said, when we were seated. "I understand that you have experienced similar symptoms to hers, and have recovered." "I have not completely recovered," I replied. "Often I have little recurrences of lapse of memory for periods from a few moments to a quarter of an hour." "My sister has told me that you believe that poor Gabrielle and yourself are fellow victims of some plot." "I am certain of it, Mr. Maxwell," I replied, "and I have already devoted considerable time and more money than I could really afford in an attempt to solve the mystery of it all." "Can you explain the whole circumstances?" he asked. "I am deeply interested in my unfortunate niece." "I can relate to you a few of the facts if you wish to hear them," was my reply. I certainly had no intention of telling him all that I knew, or of the death and cremation of the mysterious Gabrielle Engledue, whoever she might have been. So I explained practically what I had told his sister. I also described how Professor Vega at Madrid had told me of the two cures effected by Professor Gourbeil of Lyons. "My sister tells me that you suggest Gabrielle should consult him," Mr. Maxwell said. "But she has consulted so many specialists. Dr. Moroni has been most kind to her. He took her to doctors in Paris and in Italy, but they could do nothing." "Well, I think that as Professor Gourbeil has cured two persons of the deadly effects of the drug, Miss Tennison should see him," I remarked. "I quite agree. It is for that reason I have come to London," he said. "I understand that you, Mr. Garfield, take a personal interest in my niece, therefore I want to ask you a favour, namely, that if I paid the expenses, would you accompany my sister and her daughter to Lyons?" "Willingly. But I will pay my own expenses, please," was my prompt reply. At first he would not hear of it, until I declined to go unless I went independently, and then we arranged for our departure. 4 days later we descended at the busy Perrache station at Lyons from the lumbering rapide which had brought us from Paris, and entered the Terminus Hotel which joins the platform. Later, from the concierge, we found that Professor Gourbeil, of the Faculté des Sciences et des Métiers, lived in the Avenue Félix Queux, and I succeeded over the telephone in making an appointment with him for the following day at noon. This I kept, going to him alone in order to explain matters. I found him to be a short, florid-faced man with a shock of white hair and a short white beard. His house was a rather large one, standing back in a well-kept garden full of flowers, and the room in which he received me was shaded and cool. I told him of Professor Vega's recommendation, whereupon he exclaimed in French: "Ah, I know Professor Vega. We met last year at our conference in Paris. A very brilliant man." Then, as briefly as I could, I explained how the deadly drug orosin had been surreptitiously administered to Gabrielle and myself, and its effects upon us both. "Orosin!" exclaimed the old savant, raising his thin hands. "Ah, there is not much hope of the lady's recovery. I have known of only 2 cases within my experience. The effect of orosin upon the human brain is mysterious and lasting. It produces a state of the brain cells with which we cannot cope. A larger dose produces strong homicidal tendencies and inevitable death, and a still larger dose almost instantaneous death." I told him how we both had lost all sense of our surroundings for weeks, and how we were both found at the roadside, she in Hampshire and I in France. "You were both victims of some plot, that is evident. Of course you have invoked the aid of the police?" I did not reply. I certainly feared to seek the assistance of Scotland Yard. He explained to me practically what Professor Vega had done regarding orosin and its terrible effect. "There have been other cases of its administration," said the great alienist. "Somebody must be preparing the drug and selling it for sinister purposes. Though it is so little known as yet that its manufacturer must be an expert toxicologist with special knowledge." "Have you seen many cases of its administration?" I asked eagerly. "Yes, quite a number," was the old professor's reply. "I am in communication with Dr. Drouot, of the Salpêtrière in Paris, and together we are keeping a record of the cases where orosin is administered by some mysterious hand. Whose, we have no idea. We leave that to the Sûreté. But you say that your adventure and that of Mademoiselle occurred in London?" I repeated my story. Then I ventured to ask: "Do you, Professor, know anything of a Dr. Moroni of Florence?" The white-bearded, shock-haired man reflected for a moment, and then, moving in his chair, replied: "I fancy I have heard his name. Moroni. Moroni? Yes, I am sure someone has mentioned him." "As a toxicologist?" "Probably. I do not really remember. I believe I met him at one of the conferences in Paris or Geneva. He was with one of your English professors, one of your medico legists whose name at the moment escapes my memory. He gave evidence in that curious case of alleged poison at the Old Bailey in London a year ago." "But is Doctor Moroni known as an expert in poison?" "Not to my personal knowledge. Possibly he is, and I have heard his name in that connection. Why do you ask?" "Because he has had my friend Miss Tennison under his care. He has taken her to see several specialists in Italy." Then, in a sudden burst of confidence, I told him of my great love for the girl who, like myself, had been attacked in secret. Further, I told him that the reason of my steady inquiry was in her interest as well as in my own. "My dear Monsieur Garfield, now that you are so frank with me, I will do my utmost in the interest of both of you," declared the old Professor as he rose and crossed to the window. "What you have told me interests me intensely. I see by your travels to Spain and the South that you are leaving no stone unturned to arrive at a true solution of the problem. And I will help you. Orosin is the least known and most dangerous drug that has ever been discovered in our modern civilization. Used with evil intent, it is unsuspected and well nigh undiscoverable, for the symptoms often resemble those of certain diseases of the brain. The person to whom the drug is administered either exhibits an exhilaration akin to undue excess of alcohol, or else the functions of the brain are entirely distorted, with a complete loss of memory or a chronic aberration of the brain." "That is the case of my friend Miss Tennison," I said. "Very well. I will see her and endeavour to do what I can to restore her," said the elegant old French savant. "But remember, I hold out no hope. In all cases orosin destroys the brain. It seems to create a slow degeneracy of the cell which nobody yet can understand. We know the effect, but we cannot, up to the present, combat it. There are yet many things in human life of which the medical men are in as complete ignorance as those who study electricity and radio frequencies. We try to do our best to the extent of our knowledge, my dear monsieur. And if you will bring mademoiselle to me to-morrow at 3 o'clock, I will try to make my diagnosis." I thanked him for his perfectly open declaration, and then I left. That he was the greatest living authority on the symptoms and effect of the mysterious drug orosin, I felt confident. I only longed that he would take Gabrielle beneath his charge and endeavour to restore her brain to its normal function. Punctually at 3 o'clock next day I called with my beloved and her mother at the house embowered in roses and geraniums up on the hill above the broad Rhone River. We were ushered in by an old manservant, silent and stately. The Professor quickly appeared, his sharp eyes upon the patient. "I wonder if you will allow me, madame, to take your daughter into my consulting room alone?" he asked in good English. "It will be best for me to question her without any other person being present." "Most certainly," Mrs. Tennison replied. Then, turning to Gabrielle, she said, "The Professor wants to put a few questions to you, dear. Will you go with him into the next room?" Gabrielle, pale-faced and tragic, looked at me strangely, and then meekly followed the old Professor into his consulting room. The door was closed, and Mrs. Tennison waited with me in silence. The window of the room was open, and through it came the sweet scent of the roses and climbing jasmine, with the buzz of the summer insects and the chatter of the birds, for the house was high up on that hill above the great silk-weaving capital of the Rhone. I rose and looked out upon the garden, so well ordered, for the Professor was, it seemed, a lover of roses, the blossoms running riot everywhere. Suddenly, as we remained in silence, we heard Gabrielle's voice raised until she shouted fierce defiant words in English. "No!" she shrieked. "It was not that! Not that! You try and fix upon me a deed that I did not do! Why should you do this? Why should you do this?" "Pardon, mademoiselle," we heard the Professor say in a quiet, calm tone. "Pardon, please. I do not allege it. I have only asked a simple question." "Your question is insulting, doctor," declared my beloved loudly. "Why should you insinuate such a thing?" "Mademoiselle, I insinuate nothing," replied the Professor. "I am endeavouring to ascertain the exact state of your mental balance. Your anger is in itself a most gratifying feature. 1,000 pardons if you feel that I have insulted you," he added with the extreme politeness of his race. Then, through the folding doors which divided the apartments, we heard him say, "Will you please give me both your hands and look directly into my eyes?" There was a silence. We could hear the Professor sigh, but he made no comment. His examination occupied nearly an hour. He put to her many searching questions in an endeavour to restore her memory as to what happened, but without avail. Those questions seemed to perturb her, for of a sudden she cried loudly, indeed she almost shrieked in terror. "Ah, no, no, save me!" she implored. I can't stand it. I can't. I really can't. See! Look, look! There it is again! All red, green, and gold! All red, green, and gold!" And we could hear her expressions of fear as she gazed upon some imaginary object which held her terrified. We heard the kindly old Professor putting many questions to her in an endeavour to discover what gave rise to that nameless horror which she so often experienced, but her replies were most vague. She seemed unable to describe the chimera of her imagination. Yet it was only too plain that on that fatal night she had seen something bearing those colours which had so impressed itself upon her mind as distinctly horrible that it constantly recurred to her. Yet she was unable to describe it, owing to her mental aberration. Time after time she implored the Professor's protection from some imaginary peril, and time after time, after she had begged him to remain near her, she repeated those mysterious and meaningless words: "Red, green, and gold! Red, green, and gold!" In breathless anxiety we listened, but all we could hear were the Professor's sighs of despair, which meant far more to Mrs. Tennison and myself than any of his words could convey. We knew that upon poor Gabrielle, the girl I loved with all my heart and soul, the deadly drug had done its work, and that she was, alas, incurable. Her case was hopeless, even in the hands of the one man in all Europe who knew the effects of orosin, and had only in 2 cases effected cures. I looked at her mother in silence. She knew my thoughts, for tears were now coursing down her pale cheeks. Both of us knew the worst. Our journey had been in vain. That thought caused me to grit my teeth against De Gex and his unholy hirelings. I would follow and unmask them. I would avenge the innocent girl whom I loved so dearly, even though it should cost me my life. Chapter 23. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 24 of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 24th. Yet Another Mystery. The first week in August was unusually hot and dry in London. Gabrielle and Mrs. Tennison had remained in Lyons, for Professor Gourbeil had suggested that his patient should, as a desperate resource, remain under his treatment for a few weeks. He gave practically no hope of her recovery. The dose of orosin that had been administered was, he declared, a larger one than that which De Gex had introduced into my drink on that night of horrors. The effect upon me had been to muddle my brain so that I had accepted those Bank of England notes as bribe to assist the mystery man of Europe in his foul and mysterious plot. My companion Harry Hambledon was still earning his guineas at Hammersmith Police Court, gradually establishing a reputation. He had bought a small 2-seater car, and each Sunday he took Norah out for runs to the hut at Wisley, to the Burford Bridge Hotel, where the genial Mr. Hunt, one of the last remaining bohemians of the days of the Junior Garrick Club, welcomed them, to the Wooton Hatch, or up to those more pretentious and less comfortable hostelries on Hindhead. Motoring had roused a new interest in my friend. I loved the open road, but with the heavy expenses I had recently sustained, I could not afford it. Besides, my firm had just secured a big electric lighting contract with the Corporation of Chichester, and I was constantly travelling between that city and London, sometimes by rail, and sometimes in Mr. Francis's car. I suppose I must have carried on my work satisfactorily after the generous leave the firm, one of those stately old-fashioned ones which still have survived the war, had accorded me. But my thoughts were ever of my beloved Gabrielle, the beautiful girl whom, though her mind was so strongly unbalanced, I yet loved with all the strength of my being. Every few days we exchanged letters. Sometimes Mrs. Tennison wrote to me from the quiet little pension in Rue Paubert in Lyons, but her letters were always despairing. Poor Gabrielle was just the same. She still had no other vista in life than her immediate one, and she still in her reflective moments gave vent to that strange ejaculation of those mysterious words: "Red, green, and gold. Red, green, and gold." I confess that I went about my business in a low-spirited, despairing mood. More than once I passed by that dark, forbidding house in Stretton Street, the blinds of which were drawn, for ever since the winter it had been closed with the caretaker in charge. Pass along Park Lane and the Mayfair neighbourhood in August, and you will see the Holland blinds drawn everywhere. The window boxes filled with geraniums and marguerites are drooping, for they have served their turn, and the families are out of town, enjoying themselves in Scotland, in Norway, or at the French spas. Honest Londoners may sweat and toil with their begrudged 14 days at the sea or in the country, but society, caring nothing for unhealthy trades or ill-paid labour, unless a strike perchance affects their pockets or their comforts, drifts to where it can flirt, dance, or gamble amid gay surroundings denied in London by our sanctimonious killjoys. Whenever I passed along Stretton Street, there spread over my mind the strange and inexplicable events of that night when De Gex's manservant Horton had dashed out after me, and suddenly implored me to see his master. Ah, I saw the amazing cleverness of the whole plot, a plot such as could only be conceived by a master brain. De Gex's dark, sinister, half Oriental countenance haunted me in my dreams. True, he was a man who swayed the finances of Europe, suave, smiling, and with an extremely polished and refined exterior. But why Suzor had purposely become acquainted with me, and why I had afterwards been enticed into that house of tragedy were, in themselves, two points the motive of which I failed to grasp. Late one evening I passed the house, going out of my way purposely to do so, when, to my amazement, I saw standing upon the doorstep and about to enter his car no other person than Oswald De Gex himself. Behind him stood a strange manservant, who at the moment seemed to be taking some instructions. In the darkness De Gex could not distinguish me, therefore I drew back and watched the world-famous financier enter the car and drive away. So Oswald De Gex was back in London, and in August! I had passed the house on the previous afternoon, and seen that, as usual, the faded Holland blinds were drawn, just as they had been for months, an indication to callers that the owner was away. I looked again. The blinds were still down. Next day being Sunday, I watched, and though at 4 o'clock in the afternoon De Gex came forth and strolled round to his club in St. James's Street, the blinds were still drawn, it being evident that the unscrupulous man who juggled with European dynasties was living there in obscurity and in pretence of absence. Why? My watchfulness was increased, my thoughts being ever upon the avenging of the injury done to the sweet girl I so dearly loved, that poor unfortunate creature whose brain had been destroyed by the dastardly administration of that poison only known to students of toxicology. In my waking hours I conjured up scenes of how mother and daughter, living in that obscure pension in busy Lyons, went each day to the Professor's house, and how the kindly old savant did his best to restore her brain to its normal activity. One hot day I had been to Reading on business for the firm, and on arrival at Paddington I bought an evening paper and took it home to Rivermead Mansions. As usual, Harry and I had dinner together, and after he had gone out to Richmond, I sat by the open window which looked upon the towing path beside the Thames, and with my pipe in my mouth scanned the day's news. Of a sudden I came across a heading which attracted me, and read as follows: "The sudden death is announced at his house outside Amsterdam of Baron Hart van Veltrup, the well-known Dutch financier, who for some years was in active association with the Spanish banker, the late Count de Chamartin. The Count died recently in San Sebastian just after he, with Van Veltrup, had promoted a great railway scheme in central Spain. The circumstances of the Baron's death appear to be somewhat mysterious," says our Amsterdam correspondent. 3 days ago the banker, who is a widower, went to The Hague, where, in a private room in an obscure hotel, he met a man on business. The meeting was apparently in secret, for he told his valet that he did not wish anyone to know of the mysterious visitor for a certain financial reason. The man remained with the Baron for nearly an hour, after which the financier went home in his car to Amsterdam, his valet driving. On the way the servant noticed that his master seemed very perturbed, once or twice muttering threats beneath his breath. On arrival at his house facing Vondel Park, he dressed, ate his dinner alone, and was about to re-enter his car to drive to the Park Schouwburg, where opera was being given that night, when he staggered and fell just outside the gate, and expired in a few moments. Though a medical examination proved that death was due to heart failure, some comment has been caused by the valet's story of his master's mysterious visitor at The Hague. The latter he describes as middle-aged, with a small dark moustache, a ruddy complexion, wearing round horn-rimmed spectacles. He thinks the latter were worn for purposes of disguise. 3 doctors have, however, declared that death ensued from natural causes, hence the police discredit the valet's story. Baron von Veltrup was well known in international finance, was a frequent visitor to London, where he had permanent chambers in Jermyn Street. He was in the habit of receiving strange callers, persons who probably gave him secret information regarding government concessions and other such matters. Therefore, it is not believed that the man whom he met in secret has any connection with his sudden and lamented death. The Baron contributed most generously to Dutch charities, especially to the Blinden Institution, of which he was one of the governors. Some of his financial deals were of outstanding magnitude. The last loan to Peru was made through his house, in combination with that of Chamartin in Madrid, while he negotiated a big loan to Serbia immediately before the war, as well as obtaining the concessions for 2 new railways in northern Italy and in Portugal. The reputation of the house of Veltrup was one of the highest standing, and the Baron's untimely death has cast a gloom over financial circles in all the European capitals. I raised my eyes from the paper and gazed across the Thames, now growing grey in the evening light. Outside the soft wind whispered in the trees, and across the long suspension bridge ran an endless stream of motor traffic into and out of London. The affair in Amsterdam was certainly curious, but what attracted me most was the fact that the dead Baron had been a partner with the late Count Chamartin, whose widow I knew by sight. The Count had also died very suddenly. So, within a short time of each other, 2 men whose names were ones to conjure with in international finance had both died. The valet's story I did not doubt. I knew that such men as the late Baron were often compelled, in their own interest, to receive visits from mysterious and often undesirable persons, most of whom were paid for their information. Every giant of finance employs his secret agents, whose duty it is to keep his principal informed of the various political and other secrets in Europe. Indeed, the great financiers know more of the underground currents of foreign politics than they do at any embassy or ministry of foreign affairs. It is their duty to know the secrets of nations, and they profit upon their knowledge. I sat ruminating. The sudden deaths of the 2 pillars of finance was, to say the least, a curious coincidence. I recollected that Chamartin had been associated with De Gex, and the object of the latter's journey to Madrid had apparently been to interview his dead friend's widow. I also remembered Professor Vega's description of the deadly effect of that secret poison orosin, that it might cause almost instant death, and that all doctors would attribute the cause to heart failure. This caused me to ponder for a long time. I read and reread the report of the Baron's death, and when I retired to bed, Harry not having yet returned, I could not sleep, so haunted was I by vague suspicions. Next day I found that I could not apply myself to work at the office, so gave it up and once more wandered towards Hyde Park Corner, and up Park Lane, where again I passed through Stretton Street. The blinds of the big dark mansion were all lowered, indicating that its owner was still out of town. Yet I knew that he was living in the half-darkness of that closed house. Why? Several days passed, when, unable to rest, I at last asked leave of absence from old Mr. Francis, and crossed by the night boat from Harwich to the Hook of Holland. On the following day I found myself in quaint old Amsterdam, that city built upon the sand in defiance of a certain text in St. Matthew, the city with its great network of canals and its many gaudily painted barges. As I left my hotel and walked to the Dam, the central square of the city, my nostrils were saluted upon one side by the perfume of flowers adorning the windows and the odour of cook shops, while on the other was the smell of tar and the fumes of the humble kitchens of sailing vessels. I happened to know an Englishman employed as clerk to a firm of Dutch forwarding agents whose offices were in the Dam, and this man, whose name was Graham, I at once sought. We went out to a café together, and I explained the object of my visit, namely, the investigation of the death of Baron von Veltrup. Graham at once regarded me with considerable astonishment, for very naturally he could not make out why I should take such a keen interest in the death of one of the richest men in Holland. "The Baron died of heart failure," my friend said. "The doctors are agreed upon that. His valet told some extraordinary story, but no credence has been placed in it. There has been a good deal in the papers concerning the unfortunate affair, but the excitement has now all died down. The Baron was, I believe, buried yesterday." "I know that there is no suspicion that death was due to foul play, Graham," I said. "But I confess that in face of certain knowledge I possess, I am not altogether satisfied with the doctor's conclusion." My friend smiled incredulously. "At first the police were, I heard, inclined to suspect foul play. But after full investigation they are now quite satisfied as to the cause of death." "Be that as it may, I intend to make a few discreet inquiries," I replied resolutely. "I want you, if you will, to assist me." He smiled again in undisguised disbelief. "Of course you are at liberty to express your own opinion," he said with some reluctance, "and if you wish I will assist you. But I really think, Garfield, that you will be only wasting your time and mine." "I hope not," I assured him. "Were I not in possession of certain exclusive information, I should not venture to come here from London and trouble you, as I am doing." Graham, who I had known for a number of years, looked very straight at me. "What is the nature of this exclusive information?" he inquired. "You are concealing something, Hugh." "Yes, I know I am," was my reply as I smiled at him. "I am here to discover the truth regarding the death of Baron von Veltrup." "Then you suspect foul play, eh?" asked my friend. "Yes, I do," I replied in a low voice. "And I want you, Graham, to put me in touch with the Baron's valet." "He is a man named Folcker, a Swede, according to the newspapers. I dare say I could find him." "If you can, you will assist me very much. I must have a chat with him," I said. "I feel somehow that in face of the strange facts within my knowledge that he can give me the clue to the cause of his master's death." Graham smiled. He seemed to regard me as a person whose mind was not quite sound. But I will give him his due. He propitiated me, and promised to get into touch with Oscar Folcker. By virtue of the wide ramifications of the firm by which Graham was employed, I knew that it would be an easy matter, hence I was not surprised when next day he rang me up on the telephone to my hotel, and told me that he had been able to find the valet Folcker, who would call upon me at 6 o'clock that evening. Chapter 24. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.
Chapter 25 of the Stretton Street Affair by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 25th. What the valet knew. At the time appointed, as I stood in the hall, a tall, clean-shaven, rather spruce young man entered, and spoke to the concierge, who at once brought him over to me. I took him into a corner of the lounge, and when we were seated, I told him of my suspicions and my quest. Like many Swedes, he spoke English, and in reply said, "Well, sir, I was in the Baron's service for 5 years, and I knew his habits very well. He was an excellent master, most kind and generous, and with him I have travelled Europe up and down. We were very often in London, where the Baron had bachelor chambers in Jermyn Street." "I know that," I said. But tell me what you know and what you suspect concerning his untimely end." "There was foul play, sir," he said unhesitatingly. "The Baron was a strong, healthy man who lived frugally, and though he dealt in millions of francs, yet he was most quiet in his habits, and his boast was that he was never out of bed after 10:30. Though very rich, he devoted nearly half his income yearly to charitable institutions. I know the extent of his contributions to the needy, for I have often seen him draw the cheques." "Well, tell me exactly what happened," I asked. "The affair presents some very puzzling features, sir," he replied. "One morning while dressing, my master told me that he had to motor to The Hague, as he wished to meet in strict secrecy a man who would call to see him at a little hotel called the Rindge in the Orange Straat. He asked me to drive him there so that Mullard, the chauffeur, should have no knowledge of the visit. This I promised to do, for I can drive a car. We arrived early in the afternoon, and the Baron, who was unknown at the obscure little place, ordered lunch for us both. He ate his in the private room he had engaged, and at about 3 o'clock the visitor arrived. He inquired of the proprietor, and was shown into the Baron's private room. I judged him to be about 40, of middle height, well dressed, and wearing big round tortoiseshell glasses, like those Americans so often wear. He was red-faced, and walked with a slight limp. "And what happened while your master was with the stranger?" "The Baron came out and told me to go to the garage with the car, and I was telephoned for an hour later. When I met him again, he seemed to be in an ill and petulant mood, for he told me to drive back to Amsterdam with all speed. He also again made me promise to tell nobody of the secret meeting." "And then?" I asked anxiously. "On arrival home he washed, dressed, and dined alone. Afterwards he put on his gloves, grey suede ones, ready to go, but exchanged them for a pair of white ones as he recollected that he was going to the opera. Then he walked out to the car, but suddenly cried, 'Oh, my head, my head!' and fell on to the pavement. I was just behind him when he did so, and hurried to get him up. But he was already unconscious, and scarcely before we could get him into the house he expired." "And why do you suspect foul play?" I asked. "I feel certain that my master did not die from natural causes," declared the thin-faced manservant. "You suspect that the individual in round spectacles had a hand in it, eh?" "I do. But how, I have no idea. The police pooh-pooh my suspicions. But if my suspicions are unfounded, why has not the stranger come forward? There has been a lot about the affair in the papers." "Yes," I said. "It certainly appears strange, for there can be no cause for secrecy now that the Baron is dead, even if some great financial transaction had been involved." "My master often received very queer visitors," said Folcker. "Once he entertained two very strange-looking, shabby individuals when he was at the Isle of Vain with Mr. De Gex." "With Mr. De Gex!" I echoed. "Was the Baron a friend of his?" "Yes, an intimate friend. They often had big deals together in which Count Chamartin, who lived in Madrid, participated." "Ah, that is distinctly interesting," I said. "Did the Baron, when in London, visit Mr. De Gex at Stretton Street?" "Frequently. They were mutually interested in the great Netherlands Shipping Combine about a year ago," replied the valet. "And you usually travelled with your master, I suppose?" "Nearly always. We were frequently in Paris, Berlin, Rome, or Madrid, and naturally I learned a good deal about his business. His most intimate friend was Mr. De Gex. Do you happen to know him?" I gritted my teeth, and replied in the affirmative. "A very charming man," the valet declared. "He was always very good to the servants. I used to look after him when he visited us here in Amsterdam." "Did you ever meet a friend of his a Frenchman named Suzor?" I asked. "Yes, once, when we stayed with Mr. De Gex at Florence. He was a fellow guest with my master." "And an Italian doctor named Moroni?" Folcker shook his head as he replied, "I have no recollection of an Italian doctor. We were in Florence only 2 weeks." "Of course you know Mr. De Gex's butler, a man named Horton?" I asked. "No, the man I know is named Farmer. I haven't been to Stretton Street for over a year." It would therefore appear that Horton was a new servant. "But have you any idea how your master died?" was my next query. "None. Only something tells me that he fell victim to a plot for his assassination." "Why? "Because he more than once told me that if he died certain persons would derive great benefits." "Who? His friends?" "I suppose so." "Including De Gex?" The thin-faced man shook his head, saying, "That I cannot tell, sir. But I know that Mr. De Gex owed the Baron a very considerable sum over a financial deal regarding some oil wells in Romania. Only a few months ago he mentioned to Mr. Grant, one of his friends, in my presence, that he hoped De Gex would very soon settle with him. In fact, he seemed annoyed at the delay in the payment." The statement caused me to reflect deeply. Was it really possible that the Dutch Baron's death had been due to the machinations of this mystery man of Europe? The fact that he owed the dead man money would serve as sufficient motive. I did not overlook the deeply laid plot against myself, one that must have sent me swiftly into my grave had it not been for my providential escape. The whole amazing facts, my meeting with Suzor in the express between York and King's Cross, the trap set for me at Stretton Street, and my astounding adventures afterwards, all flashed through my mind. Oswald De Gex was a most unscrupulous person, who had climbed to fame and fortune over the ruined homes and bodies of his victims. I was now out to obtain direct and undeniable evidence of his crimes. Yet up to the present I could not go much further than mere surmise. Two of his business friends, Count Chamartin and Baron von Veltrup, had died quite suddenly. In the case of the latter, the valet expressed a positive belief that his master had not died of natural causes. This was supported by the fact that the Baron received a mysterious visitor at an obscure hotel at The Hague, a man who was apparently disguised by big-horn spectacles, and was certainly not a Dutchman. And above all that, I held most conclusive evidence that both De Gex himself and the dead bandit Despujol had used that deadly drug orosin to secure their nefarious ends. But the most irritating feature of the affair was that I was as far off as ever from solving the mystery of what happened on that memorable night in Stretton Street, or with what motive I had been induced to give a death certificate that had enabled the body of an unknown girl to be cremated. I questioned the valet Folcker still further, telling him that I had come especially from London to endeavour to elucidate the truth concerning his master's death. He was devoted to the Baron, and was highly incensed at the attitude taken by the Dutch police. "I will give you every assistance, sir," he replied. "Excellent," I said. "I would very much like to go to the Baron's house. Could you take me there?" "Most certainly, sir," was his response, and with willingness he accompanied me in a horse cab up the cobbled Leidwykstraat with its many canals to the pleasant Vondel Park, just outside the city. We stopped before a great white house, square and rather inartistic, standing back behind very high iron railings, to which we were admitted by an elderly manservant who was in charge of the place now that its owner was dead. Folcker showed me his master's handsome dressing room, which had been left practically as it was on the night of his tragic end. He showed me how the Baron had put on his evening clothes and descended to dine. He took me into the fine, handsomely furnished dining room, with big long carved table in the centre, and showed me the small round table set in the big bow window looking out upon the garden, at which the Baron always ate his meals when alone. After finishing his dinner the Baron smoked one of his Petroff cigarettes, which were especially made for him in Odessa, and then calling me, he asked for his coat and told me to ring up for the car, Folcker said. He finished his cigarette and a glass of Kümmel, at the same time scanning the evening newspaper. All the time he had been eating, however, he seemed in a very angry mood. The interview with the stranger at The Hague had somehow upset him, for once or twice he muttered angrily to himself. "Now tell me, Folcker," I asked seriously, "when he entered that little hotel at The Hague, he waited for his mysterious visitor, did he not?" "Yes, sir." "The visitor arrived and you saw him. I understand that your master came out and saw you during the interview?" "Yes. About 10 minutes after the stranger's arrival, the Baron came into the little hall of the hotel and told me that he would not require me for an hour, or perhaps more. Apparently he did not wish the car to stand outside the place for so long, lest it should be recognized, so he sent me to a garage." I hesitated. Then the stranger was left inside the hotel alone? "Yes, sir, for 2 or 3 minutes. Why?" We were standing out in the well-furnished hall, and I glanced around. "Your master was in good health as he ate his dinner and smoked his cigarette?" I remarked. "Quite. He came out of the room, and standing here I gave him his hat, coat, gloves and stick. After he had put on his coat he drew on his left-hand glove. Suddenly he tore it off again, and rubbing his fingers together impatiently said, 'I forgot, Folcker. I'm going to the opera. Give me some white gloves.' 'They were in the drawer yonder,' the valet said, pointing to a great old carved Flemish cupboard. So I got them out and handed them to him. He drew one of them on and walked down to the gate to enter the car, when he suddenly fell upon the pavement outside. You see, just yonder?' And he pointed through the open door. 'Why did he rub his fingers together, I wonder?' I remarked. 'Was it a habit of his?' 'Not at all, sir. He seemed to have a sudden pain in his fingers.' 'A pain? Why?' 'I don't know, sir. It has only this moment occurred to me.' He flung off the glove and tossed it upon the table. It's still there, as you see. Then he put on the white gloves and went down the steps and collapsed." "His head was affected?" "Yes, he cried out twice that his head hurt him. The doctors attribute his death to heart failure, but personally I doubt it, sir. I'm certain that there was foul play somewhere." I crossed to the great carved table which stood on the opposite side of the wide hall, tiled as it was with ancient blue and white Dutch tiles, and from the table took up a pair of well-worn grey suède gloves. They interested me because after putting one on the Baron had torn it off and rubbed his fingers. "Is this the glove your master wore when he went to The Hague?" I asked, selecting the left-hand one. "Yes, sir." I examined it very closely and very gingerly. The exterior presented nothing out of the ordinary, but on turning it inside out, I found in the index finger a tiny piece of steel which tumbled out upon the table. It was apparently a piece clipped from a blade of a safety razor, and keenly sharp. Anyone inserting a finger into the glove would certainly be cut by the razor edge of that sharp scrap of steel. As it lay upon the polished oak, I bent to look at it, the valet also standing near and bending down in curiosity. Upon it something had apparently been smeared, some colourless jelly it seemed. Had Baron von Veltrup fallen victim to orosin, wilfully administered? That was my instant suspicion, one that was afterwards verified by the great Dutch pathologist, Dr. Obelt, who lived in the Amstelstraat, and to whom I carried the mysterious but incriminating scrap of steel. "Without a doubt this piece of razor blade has been impregnated with a new and most deadly poison, orosin," he declared to me on the following evening as I sat in his consulting room. "The police have seen no mysterious circumstances in the unfortunate death of the Baron, who, by the way, was a very dear friend of mine. But now you have brought me this piece of steel which you took from his glove, and which no doubt must have caused a slight cut to his finger, and in consequence almost instant death, I feel it my duty to take up the matter with the authorities." "I shall be much gratified, doctor, if you will," I urged, speaking in French. "The valet's suspicions of foul play are entirely proved." "Yes, foul play, committed by somebody who possesses expert toxicological knowledge. I confess that this is the first time I have discovered orosin. The hint you gave me caused me to search for it, and that I have found it is undoubted." Later that day I accompanied the doctor to the Bureau of Police, where we were met by a very stolid official who smoked a long thin cigar all the time he talked to us. At first he treated the affair as of no importance. The medical evidence had pronounced the Baron's death as having been due to natural causes. The police could not interfere further, he declared. "Ah, but thanks to the Baron's valet, we now have evidence of a most subtle and deadly poison," declared the Dutch pathologist. "I certify that I have found upon a small piece of sharp steel which has been discovered in the dead man's glove, traces of orosin, one of the least known but most dangerous poisons." The heavy-jowled Dutch police official straightened himself in his chair. "Is that really so, doctor?" he asked in surprise, holding his cigar between his fingers. "Yes, it is," Dr. Obelt replied. "The body must be exhumed and an examination made to ascertain if there is a small cut in the first finger of the left hand. If there is, then the Baron has been secretly murdered. The valet has alleged this all along, but there being no evidence, we disbelieved him," said the official at once. "There is now evidence
"Direct evidence," said the Dutch doctor. "This Englishman here is interested in some way in the Baron's death, and after discovering the scrap of razor blade, he brought it to me." The Dutch police official knit his brows, and turning to me, asked: "Did you yourself discover this piece of metal?" "I did. From certain facts within my knowledge, I suspected that the Baron had been deliberately killed. The allegations of the valet Folcker strengthened my suspicions. Hence I travelled from London and pursued my own independent inquiries, which have resulted in the discovery of the little piece of blade inside the glove which the Baron wore when he went to interview his mysterious visitor at The Hague." "But what evidence have we that the mysterious visitor, the individual who has been referred to in the report as the man with the round horn glasses, has anything to do with the affair?" "According to the Baron's servant, the visitor was left alone for a few moments in the room where Van Veltrup had put down his gloves in order to go out and speak to his valet, who on that day was acting as his chauffeur. It was in those moments of his absence that the unknown visitor put the infected scrap of steel into the Baron's glove." "Did he not wear the gloves on his way back to Amsterdam?" asked the police official as he laid down his thin cigar. "No," I replied. "The valet is certain that instead of putting on his gloves, he thrust them into the pocket of his linen dust coat. Folcker says that when his master returned he took the gloves from the pocket of the linen coat and placed them on the table in the hall, as was his habit. It was only when the Baron was going out again that he put on the left hand one, and then suddenly drew it off and rubbed his fingers. The first finger of his left hand had undoubtedly been cut, and hence infected with that substance which causes almost instant death and the exact symptoms of heart disease." "Orosin, did you say?" asked the head of the Amsterdam police. "Yes," I replied. "Orosin, the most dangerous, subtle, and easily administered poison known to our modern toxicologists. And your great financier, Baron van Veltrup, has died by the hand of one who has wilfully administered it." "Well," said the stolid man with the scraggy beard, rather reluctantly, "I confess that this has come to me as a perfect revelation. You have only to order the exhumation of the Baron's body, and an examination of the left hand to be convinced that what this Englishman, Mr. Garfield, has discovered is the actual truth," declared Dr. Obelt, whose reputation as a pathologist was the highest in the Netherlands, and against whose opinion even the Chief of Police of Amsterdam could raise no word. "It shall be done, gentlemen," the stolid official assured us. "It shall be done in secret and at once." He was true to his word, for at noon next day I received an invitation to call again at the Police Bureau, and was there informed that a small superficial cut upon the first finger of the left hand had been discovered. Therefore there was no doubt that death had resulted from foul play. If such were the case, it seemed more than probable that to Count de Chamartin, the intimate associate of Oswald De Gex, a similar dose of orosin had been administered. Chapter 25. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 26 of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 26th. More about Mateo Sanz. The means by which the unfortunate Baron von Veltrup had met with his death was as ingenious as that practised upon me by the expert thief, Despujol. As I reflected upon all the details as related to me by the valet Folcker, I suddenly recollected that the Baron's strange visitor, the man who must have placed that sharp scrap of razor blade within his glove at the moment when the unsuspicious victim had gone outside to speak with his servant, was described as a man with a red face and a dark moustache. A man who answered such description was the elusive friend of Mademoiselle Jacques of Montauban, the motor bandit Mateo Sanz, the man who had so cleverly evaded the police, and who had no doubt been an intimate friend of Despujol. In order to confirm my suspicions, I at once telegraphed to Señor Rivero in Madrid, urging him to send me a copy of the police photograph of Sanz for identification purposes. That same day I received a reply which informed me that the photograph was in the post, hence I remained in Amsterdam awaiting its arrival. 4 days later it was handed to me,
A photograph taken in several positions of the rather round-faced, florid man whom I had seen talking to Mademoiselle at the station at Montauban. The man whom Rivero had followed, but who, on the French police going to arrest him, was found to have fled. I carried the photograph to Folker's lodgings, and there showed it to him. "That is the man who met my master, sir," he cried unhesitatingly. "Only he wore round horn spectacles. His face and moustache are the same. He was not Dutch." "No, this man is a Spaniard named Sanz, who is well known to the police," I replied. "Then they should arrest him, for he is no doubt responsible for my poor master's death." We went together to the Bureau of Police, where the valet formally identified the photograph, and made certain declarations concerning the malefactor in question. These he signed. "I happen to have seen this individual," I explained to the police commissary. "I was with Señor Rivero, head of the Spanish detective department, and we saw him at Montauban. But though Señor Rivero followed him, he escaped." "Then he is wanted, eh?" "Yes, for murder." The Dutch police official gave vent to a low grunt. "Very well," he said. "I will have inquiry made. I thank you very much for the information." It seemed to me that he was annoyed because I had dared to dispute his theory that the late Baron had died from natural causes. He was a stolid man who, having once made up his mind, would not hear any evidence to the contrary. With failing heart I saw that to move him was hopeless, so next day I returned to London, piqued and angry, yet satisfied that I had discovered the true cause of the Baron's lamentable death. Weeks passed. To pursue the inquiry further seemed quite hopeless. The summer went by, but Mrs. Tennison and her daughter still remained in Lyons. The reports were never hopeful. My poor darling was just the same. There recurred to her ever and anon a remembrance of those three colours which haunted her, red, green and gold. "The Professor was most kind," Gabrielle's mother wrote me. "He did everything in his power, and still persevered after failure upon failure." "I fear poor Gabrielle will never recover," she wrote in one of her letters. "The Professor is always optimistic, but I can read that in his heart he has no hope. The next step will, I dread to think, be hopeless imbecility." With that letter in my pocket, I went to the office in Westminster each day with leaden heart. The joys of life had become blotted out. I cared for nothing, for no one, and my interest in living further had been suddenly swept away. Harry Hambledon, as we sat together at breakfast each day, tried in vain to interest me in various ways. He urged me one evening to go with him and Norah to the Palais de Danse across Hammersmith Bridge, and I was forced to accept. But instead of dancing I sat at a side table and sipped ice drinks. Dancing had no attraction for me. Very fortunately we were extremely busy at the office. 4 big contracts had been entered into by the firm for the lighting and telephones for 4 new hotels de luxe, one at Bude in Cornwall, one in Knightsbridge, another at Llandudno in North Wales, and the 4th at Cromer. Hence I was compelled to be ever on the move between Wales, Norfolk and Cornwall, and perhaps this sudden activity prevented me from brooding too closely over the hopeless condition of the girl with whom I was so deeply in love. In these days electrical engineers have to be pretty active in order to pay their way, and though Francis and Goldsmith was an old established firm, they were nothing if not up to date in their methods. One morning, as I sat in a corner of the London Exeter Express on my way down to Bude, I read in the paper the following: "Mr. Oswald De Gex, the well-known international financier, is to be entertained on Thursday next to luncheon by the Lord Mayor and Corporation at the Mansion House. The Prime Ministers of Spain and the Netherlands, who are in London on official business, will be included among the guests. Mr. De Gex, though he has a house in London, is seldom here. He has recently been engaged in a great financial scheme to secure for England the whole of the output of the rich oil field recently discovered in Ecuador." So Oswald De Gex was still in London. I held my breath. With his wall of wealth before him he seemed invulnerable. I recollected those crisp Bank of England notes which still reposed in a drawer at Rivermead Mansions, the bribe I had so foolishly accepted to become his accomplice in that mysterious case. Gabrielle Engledue. Who was the girl whose body, because of my false certificate, had been reduced to ashes in order to destroy all evidence of foul play?
Who was she, and what was the motive? If I could only ascertain the latter, then I might be able to reconstruct the crime slowly, piece by piece. But as far as I could see, there was an utter absence of motive. Long ago I had arrived at the conclusion that by the death of the unknown girl named Engledue, the unscrupulous financier had added some considerable sum to his bank balance. But how? His crafty unscrupulousness was shown by the manner in which his partner, to whom he owed a big sum, had been cleverly secretly killed by a hireling, a friend of the dead Despujol. Oswald De Gex posed to the world as an honest and upright man of business whose financial aid was welcomed cordially by all the hard-up states in Europe. He posed as a philanthropist, and as such earned a big reputation in those countries in which the operations of the all-powerful group he controlled were carried on. But I knew his methods, and I sat staggered at the fact that the corporation of the City of London was about to entertain him. Yet money counts always. Did not the Lord Mayor and Corporation once entertain the man who gave a service of gold communion plate to St. Paul's Cathedral, and who afterwards spent many years in one of His Majesty's jails? My blood boiled within me when I read that announcement, yet on calmer consideration I resolved to still wait and watch. I returned to London on the following Friday, and in the train I read of the splendid luncheon given on the previous day to the arch-criminal, and the eulogistic speeches made by 2 English politicians and the 2 foreign premiers. Oswald De Gex was declared to be one of the greatest financiers of the age, and there was a hint that a certain allied government was about to enlist his efforts with a view to extricate it from national bankruptcy. De Gex was a man who thought and spoke in millions. Accompanying the article was a photograph of him standing smiling beside the Lord Mayor as guest of the City of London. Oswald De Gex seldom allowed himself to be photographed, but some enterprising press photographer had no doubt snapped him unawares. His hesitation to be photographed, public man that he was but natural. Wherever you hear of people in the public eye, male or female, who will not allow their pictures to appear in the papers, you may always suspect in that hesitation a dread of the raking up of some hidden scandal. Many a face who has looked out upon us from a pictorial newspaper or a back page of one's daily journal has caused its owner much terror, and in more than one instance a rush into obscurity to avoid the police. Scotland Yard and the Paris Sûreté have many albums of photographs, and it is not generally known that each day their counterparts are searched for in the daily journals. Oswald De Gex had on that memorable day become, against his will no doubt, a lion of London. One heard nothing of Mrs. De Gex. She was still at the Villa Clementini, no doubt. Her name was never mentioned in the very eulogistic articles which innocent men of Fleet Street penned concerning the man of colossal finance. One can never blame Fleet Street for booming any man or woman. A couple of £1,000 to a press agent will secure for a burglar an invitation to dine at the peer's table. Plainly speaking, in Europe since the war, real merit has become almost a back number. Money buys anything and anybody. I fear that, young man as I still am, I am a fierce critic of the manners of our times. I learned my perhaps old-fashioned ideas from my father, an honest, upright country person, who loved to ride with the hounds, who called a spade, and openly denounced a liar as such. He never minced matters, and stuck to his opinion, yet he was a pious, generous, open-hearted Englishman, who had no use for the international financier who has lately become the pseudonym for a foreign adventurer. The autumn days shortened, and winter was approaching, for the east winds blew chill across the Thames into my room as I shaved before my window each morning. Mrs. Tennison was still in Lyons, and Harry Hambledon went each morning to his sordid work at the Hammersmith Police Court, either prosecuting or defending in small cases. His eloquence and shrewdness as an advocate had more than once been commented upon by the stipendiary, hence he was gradually working up quite a lucrative practice. Things drifted along till the end of October. De Gex was living at Stretton Street, very occupied, I ascertained, in arranging a great development scheme for Liberia, that independent state in West Africa. In the city he was constantly expressing his regret at the unfortunate deaths of his partners, Count Chamartin of Madrid and the Baron von Veltrup of Amsterdam, but he had expressed himself ready to carry the great deal through himself, though it involved a speculation of nearly 2 millions sterling. I could hardly take up any newspaper, neither could you, my reader, for that matter, unless I saw De Gex referred to, under another name, of course. He went here and there, the guest of a cabinet minister, playing golf with the leader of the House, or spending a week end with a duke, until it seemed that the world of society had at last prevailed upon the mystery man of millions to emerge from his shell and take up his position in Mayfair. When I saw that he was a guest of certain hard-up members of the aristocracy, or of war profiteers who, dropping their H's, had bought ancestral homes, I merely smiled at the ignorance of those who were entertaining one of the greatest criminals in Europe. In the watch I kept each evening upon the house in Stretton Street, my friend Harry Hambledon assisted me. As we lurked in doorways in the vicinity, we saw the great ones of London society, of both sexes, coming and going, for Oswald De Gex had now commenced to entertain upon a lavish scale. He gave smart dinner parties and musical evenings, which the most exclusive set enjoyed. One night, after it had grown dark, I sauntered along Park Lane, as was my habit, and having turned into Stretton Street, noticed a rather shabbily dressed man, evidently a foreigner, descending the steps from De Gex's door. He turned in my direction, and we came face to face. In an instant I recognized him as the Spaniard, Mateo Sanz. He had never seen me before, therefore, when at a respectable distance, I turned and followed him along to a street off the Edgware Road, where he entered a third-class private hotel. What, I wondered, was his object in visiting De Gex, unless some other plot was in progress? I, however, did not intend, now that I knew the truth concerning the death of the Baron in Amsterdam, that the assassin should escape. Hence I took a taxi to Scotland Yard, where I was interviewed by a detective inspector, to whom I revealed the hiding place of the much wanted criminal. He thanked me, and then began to inquire what I knew concerning him. In return I told him of my friendship with the great Spanish detective Rivero, and how with the latter I had seen Sanz at the station in Montauban. Presently he rose, and telling me he would search for any request from the Spanish government for the man's arrest, he left me. He returned a quarter of an hour later with some papers in his hands, and said, "I find that the Madrid police have applied to us for this individual's arrest, and here is his photograph," and he showed me one similar to that which Rivero had sent me to Amsterdam. I of course made no mention of Oswald De Gex, but it suddenly occurred to me that if Sanz were arrested, De Gex might take fright, so I suggested that the Spaniard be kept under surveillance until the Spanish police were communicated with. "I believe Señor Rivero suspects that Sanz is one of a very dangerous gang," I said. "If so, it would be well to arrest them all." "Are the others in London, do you think?" asked the tall, dark-haired official of the Criminal Investigation Department. "That I do not know," was my reply. "I only know that Mateo Sanz is a very dangerous person who has been wanted for several years." "Well, we thank you very much for your information, sir, and we shall act upon it at once," he replied. And then I went along the stone corridor and out again into Parliament Street, well satisfied that I had at last placed one of the criminals in the hands of the police, who would, in due course, learn the true facts concerning Baron von Veltrup's mysterious end. End of chapter 26. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.
Chapter 27 of the Stretton Street Affair by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 27th. A Curious Story. At Scotland Yard they acted upon my suggestion, and at once sent a wireless message to Señor Rivero in Madrid, telling him of the discovery of the notorious Mateo Sanz. In the meantime, my curiosity was further aroused by a note sent to me by Mrs. Tennyson's servant, Mrs. Alford, next day, saying that Dr. Moroni had called at Longridge Road, and that, finding Miss Gabrielle absent,
He had put to her a number of questions concerning myself. "As I promised you, sir," the woman wrote, "I pleaded ignorance of everything. He was apparently astonished to find my mistress and Miss Gabrielle away. He asked me for their address, but I replied that they were moving from place to place on the Continent. He seemed most annoyed, and went away. I wondered what was his object in going to Longridge Road, if not for the purpose of some further evil work. Though he pretended friendliness towards Gabrielle, yet I knew that he was her enemy, just as he was mine. Moroni was in London, hence he would no doubt visit De Gex. Hambledon was unknown to Moroni, therefore he watched in Stretton Street on the following night, and in his work of observation he was assisted by Norah, who had been told something of the strange circumstances, though, of course, not the whole amazing story. Just before 11 o'clock Harry and his fiancée arrived at Rivermead Mansions in a taxi, and told me that they had seen Moroni arrive at Stretton Street about 9:30. He was admitted by a new and rather supercilious manservant, for Horton did not now seem to be in the great man's employ. 10 minutes afterwards Suzor arrived, Harry said, then about half an hour later Moroni came out. I was passing the house slowly when he came down the steps muttering fiercely to himself in Italian, Norah said. He took no notice of me, for he seemed extremely angry and excited. Indeed, as he left, he glanced back at the house, his hands clenched, and he seemed to invoke a curse upon it. "By Jove!" I gasped. "That's interesting. The precious trio have perhaps quarrelled." "Perhaps," said Hambledon, "and as a lawyer I venture to predict that if they really have we shall, ere long, obtain some very interesting disclosures." Norah stayed and had some supper, for we were all desperately hungry, and later on Harry saw her back to Richmond. 3 days later, in consequence of a message sent to me from the Hotel Cecil, I went home early from the office of Rivermead Mansions, and had only been in 5 minutes when the door bell rang. On opening it, I found my expected visitor, Signor Rivero. "Ah, my dear friend," cried the good-humoured police official, as he wrung my hand warmly. "So I have found you at last. The taxi man made a mistake in the address and took me further down the road. Well, so you have been doing good business for us, eh? You have found Mateo Sanz." "Yes, I recognized him," I said. "I have just been with Superintendent Risden of Scotland Yard, and we have seen our friend whom we have wanted for so long. He is quite unsuspicious. But I am told that 2 days ago he visited the house of Mr. De Gex." "Yes, he is his friend, just as Despujol was," I remarked. "But I cannot understand that," Rivero declared. "It seems incredible that a person of such high standing as Mr. De Gex should number bandits among his friends." "I revealed to you the truth concerning De Gex when we were in Nîmes," I said. "Even then you were half inclined to disbelieve it. Now you know the truth. The 2 business partners of Oswald De Gex, the Conde de Chamartin of Madrid and the Baron van Veltrup of Amsterdam, have both died suddenly, and at the instigation of their unsuspected friend. It has been proved that Sanz introduced the tiny scrap of infected razor blade into the Baron's glove." "At De Gex's instigation? Impossible!" "De Gex was the only person to profit by the Baron's death," I pointed out. "He owed a large sum to the Baron over a financial deal, and by the latter's death, and the destruction of certain papers, he now escapes payment." "But you surely do not allege that Mr. De Gex resorts to the use of this little known and unsuspected poison in order to secure his own ends?" cried the famous detective, as he sat opposite me in an easy chair. "When we know the truth, as I hope we may very soon, then you will be staggered," I assured him. "At present you do not know the whole of the amazing story. For certain private reasons I have been unable to reveal it to you. But slowly, piece by piece, I have been steadily working upon the mystery of certain amazing occurrences at De Gex's house in Stretton Street. By slow degrees, and after travelling up and down Europe, I have at last succeeded in finding just a streak of daylight through the impenetrable barrier so cleverly contrived in order to mystify and mislead me. If you desire to ascertain the great ramifications of the desperate plots conceived by De Gex and his friends, and take steps to combat them, it will be best to allow his accomplice Sanz further liberty. "Keep vigilant watch, but do not allow him to suspect," I urged. "He will no doubt go to Stretton Street again. Sanz, though a hired assassin as was his friend Despujol, should not be arrested yet, for the longer he remains at liberty, the more extensive will be our information against the arch schemer of Europe, Oswald De Gex." Rivero spent the evening with me. We dined at the Clarendon, across Hammersmith Bridge, and afterwards we idled in one of the foreign cafés near Piccadilly Circus. He was in London with a warrant for the arrest of Mateo Sanz in his pocket, but at my suggestion he stayed his hand. Meanwhile Sanz, all unsuspecting, was being carefully watched not only by 2 detective sergeants from Scotland Yard, but also by 2 Spanish detectives whom Rivero had brought to London with him. 2 days later, in response to a message from Rivero, I called at the Hotel Cecil on leaving the office. He met me in the marble-paved entrance hall, and I noticed at once a grave expression upon his face. "Come up to my room," he said in French. "We can talk quietly there." In surprise I went with him up in the lift to the 3rd floor, where, in a bedroom which overlooked the Embankment and the Thames beyond, he turned suddenly to me and exclaimed, still in French: "I am very troubled and mystified, Monsieur Garfield. When you made those curious allegations against Monsieur De Gex, I confess that I laughed them to scorn, but I have to day learned several facts which put an entirely fresh complexion upon the present circumstances. Last night Mateo Sanz visited De Gex again. The financier gave a musical evening, but after the departure of all the guests, Sanz called and was at once admitted to De Gex's library." "Ah!" I exclaimed. "I know that room. I have sad cause to remember it." "He remained there till nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Then he returned on foot to his hotel. My information is that on his walk back he was whistling to himself as though in high spirits." "But that is surely no extraordinary circumstance," I remarked. "Did I not tell you that De Gex is as friendly with Sanz as he was with Despujol?" "I know, but in face of other facts I have learnt, the problem presented is an amazing one." As he spoke, a tap came upon the door, and a page boy handed in a card. "Show the gentleman up," Rivero said in his broken English. "Here is some one who will relate some very strange facts. He is my friend Gonzalez Mora, an advocate who practised in Madrid before his appointment to our consulate here. I called at the consulate yesterday and saw him, when he related to me some curious fact which I have asked him to repeat to you. He is here for that purpose." A few moments later the page boy ushered in a middle-aged, well-dressed, black-bearded man who bowed elegantly when we were introduced. "Now, my dear friend," exclaimed Rivero when we were all 3 seated, "will you please tell Mr. Garfield what you explained to me yesterday?" "Certainly. I merely tell you what I know," he replied in very fair English. "It is like this. Before I left Madrid I was very friendly with a country lawyer named Ruiz Serrano, who lived at Valladolid. For some reason the late Count de Chamartin took a great fancy to my friend and constituted him his legal adviser, an appointment which brought him in quite a large income. To the lawyer of a great financier, fees are always rolling in. The Count naturally took Serrano into his confidence, and told him how, years ago, he had married the daughter of an Englishman in rather humble circumstances living in Madrid. A daughter was born to them, but later he divorced his wife, who died soon afterwards, and then married a lady of the Madrid aristocracy, the present widow. Apparently he made a will leaving the whole of his fortune to his daughter by his first wife, save for a small annuity to his second wife, and according to the will, on the death of his daughter, the fortune was to go to his trusted partner, your English financier, Mr. Oswald De Gex." I sat staring at the stranger, but uttered no word, for I was reflecting deeply. "Señor Serrano arrived in London a week ago, and came to consult me regarding the will, because it seems that the Count's daughter, who came here to learn English, she having lived in Madrid all her life, is dead." "Hence De Gex has inherited the Count's fortune?" I gasped. "What was the girl's name?" "Her name was, of course, Chamartin, but in obedience to her father's wish, after the divorce she took her mother's maiden name, and was known as Gabrielle Engledue." "Gabrielle Engledue!" I echoed. Gabrielle Engledew? End of chapter 27. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudiobooks.com. Chapter 28 of the Stretton Street Affair by William LeQueux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 28th. Love the Conqueror. The sudden revelation of the motive of the crime at Stretton Street staggered me. An hour later I saw the Count's lawyer, Signor Serrano, at his hotel in Russell Square, and from him learned much more regarding his late client's disposition of his property. The Count had apparently not been on very affectionate terms with his second wife, which accounted for him leaving the bulk of his fortune to his daughter Gabrielle, and, in the case of her death, to his partner De Gex, whom he had, of course, believed to be an honest man. The Count had died suddenly several months before his daughter. He had died from orosin, no doubt administered by someone in De Gex's pay. Then, almost before the will could be proved in the girl's favour, Signor Serrano learned that the girl herself had died in England. Since then he had been constantly occupied in straightening out his late client's affairs, and had now come to London for the first time in order to see Oswald De Gex, who had been constantly pressing for a settlement of the estate. He had seen him on the previous day, when he appeared to be anxious that the affair should be cleared up. As he spoke of his late partner and of his daughter, tears came to his eyes, said the Spanish lawyer, speaking in French. Tears in the eyes of Oswald De Gex. I smiled at the thought. As for Rivero, he now became just as puzzled as I was myself. To me the motive of poor Gabrielle Engledew's death was now quite apparent, and, moreover, it seemed that the reason De Gex required a forged death certificate was because he was not exactly certain whether by a post-mortem examination any trace of the drug could be found. He was not quite sure that one or the other of the great London pathologists might not identify orosin. With the Count's death on the Continent he had taken the risk, well knowing that any ordinary doctor would pronounce death as being due to heart failure, as indeed it was. In London, however, he felt impelled to take precautions, and they were very elaborate and cunning ones, as I now knew. With the motive thus apparent, I felt myself on the verge of triumph. Yet without full knowledge of what occurred to my poor beloved on that night, how could I denounce the arch criminal whose favours were now being sought by the great ones of the land? I was still in a quandary. I had established to my own satisfaction that Tito Moroni, the doctor of the Via Cavezzo, was the person who had distilled the orosin, and who had no doubt introduced it to his wealthy but unscrupulous patient as a means of ridding himself of unwanted persons and enriching himself at the same time. Indeed, these facts were eventually proved up to the hilt. The motives for the deaths of the Conde de Chamartin, his daughter, and the philanthropic Dutch financier were all quite plain, but of course I said nothing to Rivero or to anybody else regarding my acceptance of a bribe to assist De Gex in the committal of a crime. I confess that on that night of horror I had no suspicion of foul play, for knowing the great financier as a person of very high standing, I naturally believed the story of his niece's sudden death. It was not until I found myself in the hospital at St. Malo that I realized how cleverly I had been tricked. The drug had been administered to me in just sufficient dose to ensure that my brain should be affected, and that any story I might afterwards tell should be discredited. Happily, however, I had now nearly completely recovered. I was the third person known to return to their normal senses after a dose of orosin. Would there be a fourth? 3 further days went past, watchful, anxious days. De Gex was still at Stretton Street, apparently quite unconscious that his hireling Sanz was being kept under close surveillance. Another plot was in progress, without a doubt. Twice again had the elusive Spaniard, who was such a close friend of the notorious Despujol, visited Stretton Street. It seemed, too, that De Gex, though anxious to return to Italy, still remained in London in the hope that Signor Serrano would arrange for the immediate transfer of the Count's property. One could scarcely take up a newspaper without finding that Oswald De Gex had attended this function or that, for he was apparently courting the favours of certain high political personages, no doubt with a view to a place in the next honours list. I smiled within myself as I read of all the great man's doings, of his vast financial interests, of his estates in England and Italy, and his assistance to the Ministry of Finance of Spain. Often indeed when at home I discussed the situation with Hambledon, yet without the evidence of Gabrielle Tennison we could not act. Nearly a week had passed since my first meeting with the Spanish lawyer Serrano. Tito Moroni had apparently returned to Italy, for he had not been again to Stretton Street. His last visit there had no doubt resulted in a quarrel with his wealthy client, whom I had suspicions he was blackmailing, for such would undoubtedly be the procedure of a blackguard of his calibre. More than once Rivero seemed anxious to secure the arrest of Mateo Sanz, but I constantly urged him to remain patient. He frequently begged me to reveal the true extent of my knowledge, but I always evaded his questions because I was not yet in a position to make a triumphant coup and avenge poor Gabrielle. Daily, hourly indeed, was she in my thoughts. The letters I received from Lyons were the reverse of hopeful. The last one indeed reported that little or no progress had been noted during the week she had been under the care of the kindly old professor. One evening, on returning from the office, I found upon the hall table a note in Mrs. Tennison's well-known hand. It had been written from Longridge Road a few hours before, and in it she asked me to call that evening as they had returned from France. Naturally, I lost no time in dashing over to Earl's Court, and with failing heart I entered the well-remembered artistic little drawing-room where Gabrielle herself, in a cool frock of cream washing silk trimmed with narrow edgings of jade green, rose smiling to greet me. Her face was changed, for her countenance was now bright and vivacious, and her eyes merry and sparkling. The hard set expression had gone, and she looked very alert and indescribably sweet. "Well, Mr. Garfield," she cried merrily, shaking my hand in warm welcome, so different from her usual apathetic attitude towards me. "You see, we're back again. Mother has just gone round to Aunt Alice's in Cromwell Road, but she told me that you would call." "Well, Miss Tennison," I exclaimed, holding her soft little hand in mine and looking into her eyes, I hope that you feel better. Indeed, you look quite changed." "Yes. I can recollect everything now. All the past has come back to me, thanks to the old professor. He was so very kind and so patient that I can never thank him sufficiently. Or you, Mr. Garfield, for discovering him. I feel quite myself again. And it was all so sudden. At first the treatment gave me no relief, my brain seemed so muddled, but quite suddenly, one day, I found that I could recollect the past, all that happened to me on that terrible night, and in 3 days the professor announced that I had been quite recovered." My heart leaped with joy. She was cured! Cured! "Tell me all that you recollect regarding the events of that night," I urged breathlessly, as we sat together in the little London drawing-room. I looked at her countenance and realized now that it was full of life and animation, how very beautiful she was. How different from when I had seen her half dragged along the streets of Florence by her pretended friend Moroni. But justice was at hand, so I urged her to tell me exactly what happened. I give it to you, my reader, in my love's own words, just as she related it to me. "Well," she said, drawing a long breath, "one night, about 12 months ago, I was at a private dance at the house of a friend in Holland Park, when I was introduced to a young married woman named Cullerton, the wife of a man on the Stock Exchange. I rather liked her, and as she invited me to a small dance which she gave a week later, we soon became friends. One day, while we were walking together in Bond Street, we met Mr. De Gex, the great financier, to whom she introduced me. His car was standing at the curb, so he took us back to tea at his house in Stretton Street. While we were at tea, a tall, dark, Spanish-looking girl came in and was introduced to us as Gabrielle Engledue. As we sat at tea we laughed over the similarity of our names, and she told me that though her mother had been English, she had lived all her life in Madrid, and had been over here for the purpose of studying English. She had been staying with a family somewhere in Essex, but was now at a hotel in London, for she was returning to Madrid in a few days. I rather liked her, and as Mr. De Gex was charming to us both, I accepted his invitation to dine there a few days later. I did not tell mother about this, for I feared that, being rather old-fashioned, she might disapprove of my new friendships. We had a delightful dinner, and Mr. De Gex took us all three to the theatre afterwards, and drove each of us home. I was the first, and he put me down at the corner of Earl's Court Road. On the night of November the 7th, at very short notice, Mr. De Gex had again invited Miss Engledew and myself, through Mrs. Cullerton, to dinner, for she was leaving for Madrid next day, her luggage having already been sent to the station cloakroom, she told me. We understood that Mr. and Mrs. Cullerton were also coming. We did not put on dinner dresses, as Mr. De Gex said he intended to take us to a show at Olympia afterwards. I was, I know, foolish not to tell mother where I was going, but the reason for it I have already explained. When I arrived at Stretton Street after my dancing lesson, Gabrielle Engledew was already there chatting with Mr. De Gex in the library. He told me that he had just received a telephone message from Mr. Cullerton, saying that his wife had been taken rather unwell, and therefore could not come. So we three sat down, the only other guest being a man I now recollect as one who afterwards proved my friend, Dr. Moroni. The meal was quite a merry one, for Mr. De Gex was quite a ladies' man when his wife was absent. At that time I understood that Mrs. De Gex was remaining in Italy. The meal was served by a man whom the great financier addressed as Horton, and just before coffee was brought in, I recollect that Moroni left the table and went to the telephone. Then, on his return, the man Horton brought in the cups which were already filled. The man put down a cup before me, but De Gex, noticing that it was a little too full, politely exchanged his for mine. We were chatting, and Mr. De Gex had just said that it was about time we were off to Olympia, when I sipped my coffee. I noticed that both Dr. Moroni and his host glanced at me curiously. The coffee tasted unusually sweet, and also it seemed to be slightly perfumed, I remember, almost like pot-pourri. I had just replaced the cup upon the table when I felt a most violent pain in my head, and cried out. Miss Engledew was at my side in an instant, but I felt a sensation of giddiness, and next moment I knew nothing more. I remained silent for a few seconds, thinking deeply over her remarkable story. Then Miss Engledew was quite well at the time? I asked. Quite. She sprang to my assistance. Then you were taken ill before she became similarly affected? Was she? I did not know that, said my beloved in surprise. Yes, you were rendered unconscious by a drug which produced all the symptoms of death, but Miss Engledew was afterwards deliberately killed. Gabrielle stared at me as though she believed that I was bereft of my senses. Was Gabrielle Engledew killed? She gasped. Surely she was not. She was, I replied, and her body was afterwards cremated. My beloved gave vent to a shriek of horror, and what more natural? She now realized for the first time that she had been the victim of a clever and amazing plot. I recollect, she said, that just at the moment of my sudden seizure I seemed to become fascinated by the gorgeous Spanish shawl which Gabrielle Engledew had around her shoulders. It was a most beautifully embroidered silk shawl with long, heavy fringe, and flowers worked in red, green, and gold upon a silk fabric. I had been admiring it all the time I sat at the table, but the colours seemed so dazzling as to bewilder me, to muddle my senses. Red, green, and gold. How often had those words of hers puzzled me. Now I knew the truth. That magnificent Spanish shawl had stood out in her recollection as the last object she had seen before the deadly orosin had done its work. Then I told her my own story. I was inveigled by a specious story into that house soon after you had sipped your coffee, perhaps even before, I said. The library was filled with a curious, overpowering perfume of pot-pourri which overcame me, and then De Gex gave me a liqueur glass of brandy into which there had been introduced that most baneful of all drugs, orosin. It took immediate effect upon me, and a few moments later I was shown you lying upon the bed as though you were dead. Indeed, I believed you to be dead, and in the muddled state of my brain I actually gave a certificate with which that fiend De Gex had already provided himself. I declared that you had died of heart disease, a malady for which I had for some months treated you." "But I knew nothing more until I was found on the road in Hampshire," she said. "And I knew nothing more until I found myself in a hospital over at St. Malo," I went on. "The drug orosin in small doses destroys the memory. In large doses it produces an effect of death, and in still larger ones, like that administered to your friend the Anglo-Spanish girl Miss Engledue, causes instant death, with no symptoms that the post-mortem can distinguish other than the natural cause of sudden heart failure." "Was I given the drug deliberately?" asked Gabrielle, looking at me with her wonderful wide open eyes so different from those dull fixed ones which I had seen in the Duomo in old Florence, when she had raised herself from praying in her half demented state, while the sinister Italian doctor stood behind her. "Yes," I said. "De Gex passed his coffee cup to you, smiling and without compunction, well knowing the effect it must have upon you, at the same time his intention being to kill your friend Miss Engledue by administering a stronger dose. This must have been accomplished by the injection of some wound or slight abrasion of the skin, so that the drug should be introduced directly into the system and not by the mouth. Such a method would cause almost instant death." "But did Gabrielle Engledue die?" she asked excitedly. "Yes, she did. And by her death De Gex inherits the fortune of her father, a rich Spaniard, the Conde de Chamartin." She looked at me utterly bewildered, and well the poor girl might be. She now realized that she had been the victim of an amazing plot conceived by a master criminal, who was at the same time immensely wealthy, yet who cared nothing for human life so long as he amassed a colossal fortune. "All this, Mr. Garfield, is most astounding," she declared, gazing with bewilderment around the room. "It seems incredible." "Yes, Miss Tennison, I know it does," I replied. "But have patience, and I will prove to you the true depth of the villainy of our mutual enemy and his well-paid sycophants." Then of a sudden I grasped her soft hand in mine, and for a few seconds held it. I looked steadily into her wonderful eyes, and then slowly I raised her hand to my lips and kissed it. "Gabrielle," I whispered, bending to her in deep earnest, "my triumph over your enemies is yours yours. Wait, and I will reveal to you the whole facts facts more astounding than have ever been conceived in the most sensational pages of modern fiction." She did not withdraw her hand, and by her inert attitude I realized with indescribable joy that she really reciprocated my love. I am not an emotional man, neither am I an ideal lover. I am only a mere man of the world. Hence perhaps the reader will forgive me if I fail to describe all the ecstasy of affection which I experienced at that moment. I loved Gabrielle Tennison with all my soul, and I now knew that she loved me. That surely was all sufficient. With Gabrielle I had been a fellow victim of a deeply laid and most foul plot. That I had been purposely marked down with the aid of De Gex's accomplice and sycophant, Gaston Suzor, was made more than plain as I pursued my inquiries. The plot by which De Gex had hoped to secure his partner's fortune was indeed worthy the evil, ever scheming mind of the mystery man of Europe, the man whose unseen influence made itself felt in every great political move on the Continent, the man whose 100 agents were ready in secret to do his bidding and perform any dirty work for payment. After the Conde de Chamartin had been secretly attacked in the train on his way to Paris, and had died in the hospital at San Sebastian, Oswald De Gex suddenly found to his dismay that whatever claim he made upon his late partner's estate, practically the whole would go to his daughter. Therefore, while being a little apprehensive lest orosin could be detected in a body after death by an expert pathologist, he resorted to that elaborate and remarkable plot in order to exhibit to me what I presumed to be the body of Gabrielle Engledue, and induce me to forge a death certificate in the name of a doctor whose surname was the same as my own. The fact that he actually provided himself with a genuine sheet of the doctor's notepaper, and that, as I now learnt for the first time, Moroni was actually in the house when the drug was given to Gabrielle and myself prior to the death of the chief victim, showed the utter callousness of the crime. Indeed, Gabrielle Engledue was actually witness of my beloved's mysterious seizure, little dreaming that in a short hour she herself would fall victim to the cupidity of that relentless poisoner who, by his crimes, hoped to amass one of the most colossal fortunes in the world. I sat with Gabrielle discussing the amazing affair until darkness slowly fell. I told her of my own astounding adventures and my narrow escape from death in Madrid, to all of which she listened with breathless interest. Then, rising, I took her hand again, and with whispered words I pressed my lips to hers for the first time in a long but sacred caress. She sighed. I felt her quiver as I pressed her to me, and then, to my delight, I felt her sweet, warm lips cling at last affectionately to mine. Chapter 28. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 29 of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter the 29th. Another Plot. Among my letters on the following morning was a small packet which I opened. Within was a tablet of dark brown toilet soap bearing the name of a well-known firm of manufacturers. With it was a typewritten letter upon dark blue commercial paper with a printed heading. I was addressed as H. Granfield, Esquire, and the letter proved to be a polite intimation that as the firm in question was putting on to the market a new brand of toilet soap, they begged me to accept with their compliments the enclosed sample. I was also informed that, if I liked it, I could purchase it of their agents, a certain firm of chemists in King Street, Hammersmith. "Looks rather decent soap," remarked Harry as I passed it to him, and then I rewrapped it in its paper and placed it aside. At 11 o'clock I sat with Rivero, Gabrielle, and Harry Hambledon in the dull reception room at Scotland Yard, that same room wherein I had given information concerning the whereabouts of Mateo Sanz. The superintendent who received us was a well-dressed, courtly man, rather stout and elderly, who became intensely interested when I related the whole story, much as I have set it down in the foregoing pages. The consultation was a momentous one. Rivero sat amazed when I described my chance meeting with Gaston Suzor, and the clever manner in which I had been inveigled into De Gex's house in Stretton Street. Indeed, on comparing Gabrielle's story with my own, I now saw that at the time I entered the house both she and the girl Engledue were in their normal health. The coffee had not then been served, though Moroni had gone out of the room, no doubt to put the drug into the cup which was to be offered to Gabrielle Tennison, and which apparently was placed by mistake before the mystery man himself. Or else the changing of the cups was to allay any suspicion that might arise in the mind of the other victim, which was perhaps most likely. According to Gabrielle, it seemed that at the moment of her seizure Horton re-entered the room and said some words in a low tone to his master, whereupon the latter rose, left the table, and evidently went to greet me, leaving Gabrielle in Miss Engledue's care. Horton, even though he had been engaged in serving the dinner at the rear of the house, was apparently also on the lookout for me, and now I recollected that on my journey down from York I had mentioned to Suzor my habit of going to visit my uncle in Orchard Street on certain evenings. He had asked me to dine with him on the 7th, but I had excused myself, as my uncle would expect me that evening. He evidently held previous knowledge that the route I habitually took was through Stretton Street, hence the plot to get me within that house. Besides, it was quite likely that Suzor himself was watching for me, and had sent Horton out to call me. In any case, the plot had been well timed and elaborately thought out. The fact was plain that Gabrielle Engledue, who had sent her luggage to the station cloakroom and was about to return to Madrid, was killed, probably by the scratch of a pin upon which orosin had been placed. "All this is most astounding," declared Superintendent Fletcher. "Of course, De Gex contrived that no inquiry would be made concerning the dead girl. He might have shown you the body of Miss Engledue, but he had some motive in keeping it from you and obtaining a death certificate for the girl who was still living. The motive was that he was not quite certain whether the orosin could be detected. Since then he has grown bolder, as witness the murder of the Baron van Veltrup," I replied. "But why should he not have shown you the dead girl?" queried the superintendent. "Because he no doubt wished to mystify me in case of my recovery from the effects of the drug," was my reply. "He was not quite certain of the effect that the dose might have upon me, so in order to entirely mislead me so that if I recovered my statements would be discredited, he showed me a girl who was still living, though to all intents dead. Indeed, I have come to the conclusion that, aided by Moroni, he purposely contrived that I should meet and recognize in Miss Tennison the girl I had been told was the dead girl, Gabrielle Engledue. And I confess that I have been sorely puzzled all along that the girl whom I had seen dead was actually alive, even though her mental state was such as to show that she had met with foul play." "Yes," remarked Rivero, "the plot was very cunningly conceived, especially the manner in which you were entrapped and induced to give the certificate." "Here is the money which De Gex gave me for my share in the crime," I said openly, laying the bank notes upon the superintendent's table. "I suppose some action will be taken against me, but I am prepared to take the consequences now that I have unmasked one of the greatest and most dangerous criminals of modern times." "You certainly have done that, Mr. Garfield," remarked Superintendent Fletcher, "and I venture to think that the part which you have played in solving this problem will be taken into account when your own actions are considered." "It seems to me," remarked Rivero, "that the reason the poison maker Moroni evinced such a keen interest in Miss Tennison, and his reason for taking her to a number of specialists, was solely in order to gain their opinions and so further study the effects of the deadly drug which he prepared." "I have learned," I said, "that Moroni was the laboratory assistant of the late Professor Orosi, the discoverer of the drug." "Ah, then of course he knows the secret of its preparation, how to administer it, and in what doses," remarked Fletcher. "Even to day," I said, "I have had yet another attempt upon my life made by these scoundrels," and from my pocket I drew the little packet containing the sample cake of toilet soap, which I displayed to them all. Then, handling it in the thick brown paper wrapping, I took my pocket knife and scraped the soap, quickly revealing a number of sharp steel points embedded in it. "You see there are sharp clippings in it. Each has no doubt been treated with orosin," I said. "Had I washed my hands with it as a trial, they would have become scratched and infected with the deadly poison before I was aware of it." "Sanz has no doubt sent you that," remarked Rivero instantly. "Well, Hugh, it is certainly a providential escape that you discovered in time this latest plot against you," exclaimed Gabrielle. "Really, the craft and cunning of De Gex is without limit." "But I think, Miss Tennison, that you need have nothing further to fear from him," said the superintendent with satisfaction. "He has, no doubt, very powerful friends, and if the evidence were not so damning and direct as that collected after so much patience and perseverance by Mr. Garfield, he might perhaps wriggle out of it. But once we have him he can hope for no escape," he added, "and we shall arrest him before an hour is out. Fortunately he is still quite unsuspicious, though his chief fear is of Mr. Garfield and of the ugly revelations which either Moroni or Sanz could make. Nevertheless, we shall see." Chapter 29. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Conclusion of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Conclusion. Just after noon I accompanied Superintendent Fletcher and Señor Rivero, with 3 detectives from Scotland Yard, to the little hotel at Notting Hill Gate where Mateo Sanz was then staying, for he had twice changed his abode within the past week. Rivero saw the proprietor, and, giving his name as Sanchez Orozco, a well-known criminal and friend of his, asked to see his visitor, who he knew had taken the name of Ordez, and represented himself as an agent of a firm of Spanish wine exporters. Mention of the name of Orozco at once brought the much sought-after bandit downstairs, and as he entered the little sitting-room Rivero covered him instantly with his automatic pistol, shouting to him authoritatively in Spanish. The notorious bandit staggered, so completely was he taken aback. "You know me, Sanz," exclaimed Rivero. "You are under arrest. Now tell me who prepared that cake of soap which you sent to Mr. Garfield." The question was quite an unorthodox procedure in English justice, but it was the chief of the Spanish detective department who had arrested a Spanish criminal. "Find out," was the fellow's defiant retort. "It was Oswald De Gex," said Rivero. "You won't deny that. You may as well tell the truth, and things may go better with you. He was Despujol's friend as well as yours, was he not?" "Yes," the dark-faced man admitted sullenly. "We have both done his dirty work, and Moroni assisted him. You sent that soap to Mr. Garfield, eh?" The man under arrest, with Rivero's pistol still pointed at him, nodded in the affirmative. "And you went to The Hague and there met the Baron van Veltrup? You put that little piece of steel into his glove? I know that you did," Rivero went on relentlessly. "Yes, De Gex paid me for it," was his reply. "As he paid Despujol, eh?" "Yes." "Very well," replied Rivero. "I will note your replies. De Gex is expecting you to call upon him to day, is he not?" "Yes, at 1 o'clock. I was to receive some money." He laughed grimly. The Spaniard having been taken away in a taxi to Bow Street Police Station, together with his luggage, we went on to Stretton Street. "Mr. De Gex is not in," replied the manservant who appeared in answer to my ring. "Never mind," I said. "My friends and I have some business with him." And I walked into that big familiar hall, followed by Superintendent Fletcher, Señor Rivero, and 2 detectives. "We have a meeting here," I explained casually to the smart manservant, who in surprise at our sudden entry showed us to the library, that same room in which I remembered sitting on that fateful November night. It was nearly a year ago since I had last been in that big, handsomely furnished apartment. I did not remain there, for it was my intention to greet my would-be murderer on his return. Therefore I went to the hall, and there awaited him. Just before 1 o'clock he entered with his latchkey, and he having closed the door, I stepped forward in his path. "I think you know me, Mr. De Gex," I exclaimed very firmly, my eyes fixed on him. He started, and for a second went pale. Then in indignation he exclaimed: "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I am here to see you, Mr. De Gex," I replied quite calmly. "I don't know you," he declared angrily. "Perhaps not," I laughed. "But there are others with me here who wish to speak a few words with you." As I said this, Superintendent Fletcher stepped forward, while behind him came the others. "Mr. Oswald De Gex?" he asked. "Is that your name?" The owner of the big mansion went pale to the lips, and muttered an affirmative. "I hold a warrant for your arrest on the charge of the wilful murder of Gabrielle Engledue on the 7th of November last," said the Superintendent. "Your accomplice Sanz is already under arrest, I may tell you, and orders have gone out to Paris and to Florence for the arrest of your friends Suzor and Moroni." Then turning to his lieutenants, he gave orders for the great financier to be secured. So utterly aghast was the guilty man at our sudden appearance, and the terrible charge levelled against him, that he was quite unable to speak. He tried to articulate, to protest, but his tongue seemed tied. Only a low gurgling sound escaped his lips, and the next second he had collapsed into the arms of the detectives, who half carried him out to the taxi which stood near by in readiness. He was placed in a cell at Bow Street to await his appearance before the stipendiary on the following day, but an hour later when the warder went to him, he found him dead. Upon the thumb of his left hand was a slight punctured wound. Rather than face a trial and the penalty for his crimes, he had killed himself by that same most deadly drug by which he had sought to enrich himself. Next day all the world rang with the sensational news of the arrest and suicide of the mighty millionaire of Europe, but De Gex had many influential friends, hence to the public the actual truth was never disclosed. Mateo Sanz was extradited to Spain, where at the Assize Court at Madrid he was, 6 months later, sentenced to death and in due course executed, while Moroni, after many delays, as is usual in the Italian courts, was sentenced to 15 years' imprisonment for being in the possession of orosin and also attempting to administer it. The charge against him of having had a hand in the heartless murder of poor Gabrielle Engledue was unfortunately not substantiated for lack of evidence. Though the police are still seeking everywhere for Gaston Suzor, he has not up to the present been found. They, however, do not despair of arresting him. At first it was resolved to seek the manservant Horton and arrest him, but as it seemed that he had had no actual hand in the girl's assassination, and as, moreover, the murderer had committed suicide, his evidence was not required, the hue and cry after him was dropped. And myself? What need I say, except that to day I am extremely happy. Owing to the sudden great rise of some securities which my father left me, I later found myself quite well off. Indeed, upon the death of old Mr. Francis a few months ago, I was able to purchase a partnership in the firm, and I am thankful to say we are doing quite well in face of the strenuous competition in electrical engineering. Gabrielle Tennison, the sweet, open-hearted girl whom I first met under such extraordinary circumstances, is now my wife. We live very happily in a charming old-world farmhouse embowered in roses and honeysuckle, on the Portsmouth Road at Cobham in Surrey. Life nowadays is one of idyllic bliss, of perfect love and undisturbed peace, different indeed from that fevered year of struggle, adventure, travel, and unrest, during which I strove so steadily and with all my might to avenge the crimes of Oswald De Gex, and to unravel that tangled skein of the misdeeds of the international financier, the Stretton Street affair. This is the end of the Stretton Street Affair by William Le Queux. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.